Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Barry Friedman. I'm a law professor here at NYU and the director of the Policing Project. And on behalf of the project and the law school, I'm really happy to welcome you here. It's an amazing group of people from so many different aspects of policing, social science, the foundation world, vendors. It's remarkable to have you all in one room, and we're really grateful to have you. So I just want to say a word about the Policing Project, if this is the first that you've heard of us or hearing of us. We are a center here at the law school, and we are dedicated to what we call front-end accountability. So in the last few years of turmoil around policing, there's a lot of call for change and reform, concern about sanctions, and much of that is about what we call back-end accountability, which is 1414 actions by the DOJ, or criminal prosecutions, or civilian review boards, even body cameras, which we're going to talk about in a moment, are ways of addressing a problem that's happened in policing after something's gone wrong. At the Policing Project, we're trying to focus on things at the front end to try to keep them from going wrong, largely by developing policies and best practices, adding the community voice to policing. Community voice and democratic policing are incredibly important to us. We work in what we think of as 4 general areas. The first is to encourage meaningful transparency around policing so that folks can understand what goes on. The second is to study and explore best practices in policing, figure out what works. The third is to promote those best practices. And finally, to figure out a way to have meaningful voice in what occurs in policing. As part of front-end accountability, one of the things that we care a lot about is cost-benefit analysis, and so that's what we're here to talk about today. And I'm going to warm everybody up by asking a question that's been on my mind for the last couple of weeks. So I'm just curious to see a show of hands of who's wondering what the heck we're going to talk about today. Anyone? Or everybody has a pretty... You could be honest, it's okay. We're wondering too. You know, I work in an institution here at NYU where cost-benefit analysis is talked about all the time. It's talked about in the context of environmental regulation. It's talked about in the context of labor regulations, health and safety, finance. And as I worked in the policing area, I was surprised to find that there was very little conversation about cost-benefit analysis in 2 domains, and I want to stress the 2 domains because we're going to bounce between them today. On the one hand, there's the domain of researchers. There are some researchers, certainly, who have done things around cost-benefit analysis in policing, but they are very few, remarkably, compared to other fields. And even when that happens, there's been very little attention to trying to do cost-benefit analysis around intangible costs, things like community trust, things like racial profiling harms, and trying to actually monetize those the way we can monetize hard costs. And so that's kind of one whole. But the other one is on the practitioner side of things, where I rarely hear anything like cost-benefit analysis being discussed in command staff rooms. And we're hoping through this gathering to try to change in both of those domains, to foster more research, to interest funders in funding more of this research, to persuade practitioners that this is a way to approach problems. So that's the goal of the day. I just want to point out that a number of our staff here, if you need help, and they've got a red banner on their name tags. Our advisory board is here. We had our first board meeting yesterday, and they're great folks, and I think on their name tags there's an indication as well. Our co-chairs, Vanita Gupta and Scott Thompson. Scott's the chief in Camden, and Vanita is the head of the leadership conference, have been of huge value to all of us. When we set out to do something, not an auspicious sound, when we set out to do something around cost-benefit analysis in policing, we approached the Laura and John Arnold Foundation and pitched this idea to them. And we have a number of folks. I've seen Kristen Bechtel and Alex Truteau here, and I know Jeremy Travis is going to be here in a little bit. And we went to them and we said, we want to do a 2-stage project. So the first stage is to gather academics from a lot of disciplines, not just criminology, but a lot of disciplines where cost-benefit analysis takes place, economists, other social scientists, political scientists, and talk about whether it makes sense to do it around policing and what are the special challenges. And as a result of that first phase and first convening, we released this, which you can find on our website, which is a report about some of the benefits and challenges of doing cost-benefit analysis around policing practices. The second stage was then to do what we called proto-CBAs. We didn't have the funding to sort of do a full CBA in each of these areas, but to go to a number of jurisdictions and start to do a CBA and see what we could learn about the possibilities and about the challenges. So we've gone to Asheville to think about de-escalation training, and to Roanoke to think about pursuit policies, and to St. Louis County to think about ShotSpotter, and to Nashville to think about traffic stops. We're hoping to soon be in Houston working on some technology issues, because we hear from police officials everywhere that they're overwhelmed with technology choices and they don't know how to choose among them, and we think cost-benefit analysis is the way to do that. We have a lot of our partners in the room. I know I'm going to miss naming some of them, but Chief Hall from Roanoke and Chief Hooper, I think, is going to be here from Asheville later. Chief Hager from Nashville is here. Jillian Carr, one of our researchers, is here. Tom Clark is here. I'm going to just miss people, so maybe I should. Shard Goyle and Ravi Shroff, who are working in Nashville. A group of social scientists and policing officials who are working together to try to do this. As we started to do it, it occurred to us that it would be great to have a policing partner. And so we went to our friends at the Police Foundation and asked, would you partner up on this project with us? And Hassan Aden did wonderful work helping to set this up. But we had 3 conference calls with Police Foundation fellows to get them on the phone and say, where would cost-benefit analysis be helpful to you in your everyday practitioner world? And we were kind of overwhelmed by the answers. I mean, the answer was sort of everywhere. Anything from, should we be using drones to map traffic accidents? Should we be paying overtime to meet shortfalls in staffing, or should we be hiring? What about stop and frisk? Sort of anything you can imagine this group of folks wanted to know about. And so we're really grateful for all their help. And I want to turn the mic over for a bit to one of my dear, dear friends in policing, Jim Bierman. Jim was the chief at Redlands and is the president of the Police Foundation. And he and I met, I think, over the phone, and then had some Vietnamese food here in the village, and got to talking and realized that when we start talking, it's hard to stop us. But Jim is truly a visionary about policing and has some strong feelings about cost-benefit analysis. So, Jim?
Thanks, Barry. Good morning. As Barry alluded to, I was police chief for a long time in Southern California, and from 1993 to 2011, every year I would go through this budgetary dance, right? It's a whole process you do when you're from a smaller agency. Redlands, where I was at, is just east of Los Angeles. It's about 80,000 people, so it gives you a sense of the size. And I was struck literally every year through those processes and those dances. Why, not once, I mean, not once did anybody ever ask me, from the council to the city manager, whoever they happened to be at that time, how do you know that this works? How do you know that we're getting a bang for our buck? And toward the end of my career, which is typical probably for chiefs, I started getting a little salty, and I actually started saying things to council members and to my bosses. Why do you guys never ask me this question? Why do you, if you're going to be good stewards of the taxpayer investment in public safety, why are you not asking me, how do you know that works? Now, most of the time I probably say, I don't know that that works. In other words, what's the benefit? Because I think effectiveness and the benefit in cost-benefit analysis are pretty much synonymous, right? So this is where evidence-based policing, the movement of EBP is, I think, super important. But I would probably have said to them most of the time, I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't know. I believe that this works. I don't know that it works. And there's a huge difference between by knowing that something is effective and my belief that something is effective. Policing is driven mostly by the belief that what we're doing is effective. There's been massive changes in terms of data systems and the evaluation of processes, I think, in the last many years, and there will be increasingly so in the future. If we can give the field easy to understand templates and concepts and frameworks for answering the question, how do we know it works? How do we know that's beneficial? And then what are the costs? And so this conference and all of Barry's work and the stuff that they're doing at the Policing Project, I think, have value that is fundamental to how the public views policing and how policing views itself sometime in the future. One of the things that I said to Barry recently in a phone call is that all of you come from different fields. I know a bunch of you, so it's a little bit like a family reunion or something here. I bet there aren't very many of you that are city managers or locally elected public officials. And someday, we will have this kind of a conference or have this kind of a meeting where almost everybody there are the people who are supposed to be the stewards of the taxpayer investment in public safety. And those are the people that hold the bags of gold, right? It's the city council members, the mayor, city managers. In most communities across the United States, the city manager, city administrator, and the council are super important to this equation. And yet, they don't even know the concept, much less the questions to ask. So I think there's another audience. It's not just about the police. It is also about how do the people who pay for the police understand this idea of what's beneficial, what's effective, and what are the costs involved in that. So thanks for being here. Your input in this meeting is crucial. You should not be shy with the panelists, and this works best, I think, if it's an interactive process. So welcome.
Thank you, Jim. So in a moment, I'm going to ask the folks up here the folks whose names are up here to join us for the first panel. If you've been following along on our Twitter feed or the webpage, you know that there's been changes in personnel. There are two big things happening in the world. So we've lost a number of folks from Chicago, where if you're following the events in Chicago, there's a lot going on around policing. And there's also something going on in Washington, D.C. that dragged off, for example, Vanita Gupta, who had to leave late last night. I'm grateful to the people that stepped up at the very last minute. I think the award for sure goes to Monique Dixon, who stepped up in the last 10 minutes when Chief Lanier from D.C., who's now at the NFL, has had a family emergency and had to run to D.C. So I'm grateful for that. Why don't you all come on up and we'll just get started. I'm going to observe for the record that we are actually on time. So I'm astonished by that fact, and we'll see if that continues through the day. People hold convenings for lots of reasons. Sometimes they hold them to get like-minded people together and sort of give a push to a cause. Sometimes they hold them to bring people with very different views together and create some fire and light. I'm content if we're the sort of boring or geeky conference. So we have an idea, we think it's important to the world, and a lot of what I think we want to do during the course of the day is just teaching, is trying to explore the possibility of doing this accepted practice, a methodology in a variety of areas. We have great people to talk about it with, and I was tempted at the beginning of this panel to say, okay, this is the panel on which we're going to talk about body cameras, facial recognition, drones, predictive policing, stop and frisk, traffic stops, and go down the list, but obviously we're not going to fit that all into the allotted time. What we are going to do is start with body cameras and talk about body cameras and then pivot from there. I thought I was going to be on the floor, so there's two disadvantages. One is I can't see the slides, but I'll peek back there to see, and the other is I can't see the panelists if they're waving to say something, so I'm going to just try to keep an eye out for that. But mostly I'm going to pepper people with questions as we try to sort of walk through and figure out what is it like to think about taking cost-benefit analysis and applying it initially to what must be the most familiar thing to all of us in policing, which are body cameras, given that the country has been drenched in conversations about body cameras. So I'll start with December of 2014, in the wake of the decision by the grand jury not to indict the officer who had shot Michael Brown. President Obama convened a group of people that resulted in the formation of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. That's Lori Robinson and Chuck Ramsey on either side of the president. And as part of his announcement of initiatives, one of the things he said was that he was going to dedicate substantial federal dollars. It was about $20 million to put 50,000 body cameras on the street. One of the things we'll see in a minute is that $20 million isn't going to get you much in the way of 50,000 cameras, but we'll talk about that. But what I wanted to do was start by asking Chris Magnus, who's the chief in Tucson, and Monique Dixon, who works for Legal Defense Fund, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Why body cameras? What was the thought in the middle of this fraught moment in the country's history that the answer was going to be to put cameras on police officers? So, Chris, I'll start with you.
Well, good morning. I'm certainly not the right one to be the cheerleader for body cameras, but I am an advocate for them, and maybe for reasons a little different than what a lot of the folks, as well-intentioned as they may have been, who were some of those original, very strong cheerleaders or advocates. I know we heard, for example, following Ferguson, that body cameras were going to be an important step in building or rebuilding trust with the community. But it's certainly been my experience in several different cities. I worked in Richmond, California for 10 years as the chief there before coming to Tucson over the last 3. And I can tell you that in my experience, technology of any kind, but in particular body cameras, do not build trust. Relationships build trust. And so there is a place, I think, however, for body cameras in terms of helping with issues associated with accountability. I think they give the public an important, a valuable insight into some of the work that police do, particularly if police are really transparent with the way they provide the public with access to body camera footage. I've now worked, certainly working in Arizona, which is a very, very open records state. We provide body camera footage on a routine basis from practically any type of situation to the public whenever it's requested, and we do our best to release body camera footage, for example, following officer-involved shootings as quickly as possible, and I mean literally in days if we can, because we think it's important for the public to get a better understanding of how we handled a particular situation, even if it isn't perhaps as well as it could have been. So I think there's value in terms of a sense of accountability, not so much trust, but certainly it's an important piece of accountability. But I think there's some other values that I can say, having worked with body cameras now in several jurisdictions, that I think have come to the table. One of those is education. Education not only for the public about some of the challenges of what police do and understanding some of the situations that they're in, but I think of maybe even greater importance, education for police officers themselves. If we think about it a minute, perhaps it's an unpleasant fact of life that the way we see ourselves in terms of our interactions with others is not necessarily the case as far as how others see us in those same sort of interactions. A long story short, we had an officer when I was in Richmond who was found to, we were actually looking at footage that involved another matter entirely, but saw this officer who we'd hired he'd come to us with high accolades from another department. And we happened to see how he was interacting with the public just through watching actually footage that involved another matter entirely, investigating a complaint. And we were somewhat taken aback at the officer's behavior with the public. And his supervisor decided to do a little further inquiry and did an inventory of some of the other calls and traffic stops and situations that he was involved in, and found just a pattern of really actually pretty horrible behavior, a lot of rudeness, a lot of arrogance, just a lot of behavior that was really not what we had expected at all. And so the supervisor very smartly decided to sit down with the officer and actually show him the footage. And, they looked at it together, and the supervisor said, what's your takeaway from this? Is this really, do you realize how you come across? And the officer looked at him for a minute and said, Jesus, I come across like an asshole. And I mean, he was genuinely shocked. He really was. He was still a pretty young officer, and I think he really didn't quite grasp. I mean, I think he was shocked by what he saw. And so that became a learning tool as time went on for him to really change some of his behavior. So I guess my point is, I think there are a lot of ways. We use the body cameras in terms of teaching and training. We do a lot of review of different kinds of incidents, some critical, some maybe not so much. We use it in the academy for officers to get a sense of, critiquing themselves even. We do a lot of work around de-escalation and mental health training, and so to be able to then step back and watch yourself and see how you handled something and have that be a source of discussion. I think it's been valuable from that standpoint. It's been valuable for investigating complaints, complaints from the public, even complaints between officers on how different situations were handled. But I think it always has to be looked at as the camera provides one perspective, not the totality of what an officer necessarily experiences or even what the public necessarily sees. And so it's not the be-all, end-all of like, okay, finally we know exactly what happened. It's rarely that simple. But as a training tool, as a tool to improve accountability, as a tool that helps us with criminal cases where we need to be able to have an extra piece of evidence, perhaps to go into court, for example, DUI and other types of investigations. I think there has been real value, and most of our officers who maybe started in both the departments that I worked with these in, very reluctant, perhaps even oppositional to cameras. I think if you ask them now, they would say that by and large, they support them. There's still some concerns, but they do support them. And I think you would find that the public in the communities expects them. Perhaps we need to do more education than ever with the public about policing and about cameras, both the good and the bad, but they have brought value.
That's totally helpful. I've learned my lesson about saying this to police chiefs, but in general, we're all going to be a little crisper just because I want to keep us moving. That's okay. It was totally helpful. Monique, I want to know if you think that's a complete list and anything else you'd like to add, but I'd also ask you to just say a word about Chris's skepticism about, trust and what cameras can achieve, as well as maybe just spelling out the logic of transparency and trust for us.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. Monique, can you hear me? Okay. Great. So the civil rights community has mixed views about body-worn cameras. Like, on the one hand, body-worn police cameras as well as bystander videos, and I want to emphasize that because it's bystander videos that really has been able to capture police and civilian interactions that communities of color have known for a while has been happening with police abuse and violence. If we go back, let's go back further than 2014, the Rodney King incident was captured by a citizen bystander camera. And so for us in the civil rights community, it's important to have a video footage in order to be evidence of police conduct that we have experienced in our communities for decades. And it offers an opportunity for us to present this evidence so that courts of law and courts of public opinion understand the experiences of people in communities of color. Sadly, though, while it does expose what has happened, it does not always result in accountability, as we have seen in the case of Eric Garner, whose death was caught on video. The officer is still has not been held accountable for his death. So while I appreciate that it can be used as an accountability tool from the civil rights perspective, when you're looking at misconduct, it is not always consistently used in that way. It is a form of transparency. When I said we have mixed views, the part that is troubling to us, and is something that was just stated, was the collection of evidence. So communities of color are saturated with surveillance equipment, and body-worn cameras could serve as that another source of that type of surveillance in our communities. And so we are very hesitant and concerned about the way body-worn cameras are used. If it's used for accountability, for training, we're comfortable with that. If it's used for evidence gathering, et cetera, we would want there to be a lot more guardrails around policies and the use of these cameras.
Good, thanks, Monique. So what I'd like to do now is start with the chief again, but all of us can work together on this. I just want to make a list of the costs of body-worn cameras. So, what are the things that go into the equation? I'll show you some numbers in just a moment, and if somebody knows numbers, they should feel free to holler them out. But what does it cost? We've got this list of benefits on one side. It's a rosy picture, though there's been some hesitation on both sides. But what are the costs? What are the tangible costs that we have to think about?
I'll be as crisp as possible with the costs. So the outlay for the equipment, first of all, is a cost. The cost of training officers to use the equipment can't be, I think, understated. The cost of just utilizing the footage on an ongoing basis, whether it's for evidence or other things, requires, there are a lot of perhaps hidden costs there. There are costs associated with redaction, whether you're talking, even with software that's out there now, you still need personnel to do redaction work. And then I think there is perhaps maybe a less tangible cost, and I know I'm leaving out some, but a less tangible cost of, there is a bit of a feeling of, are we not trusted as Big Brother, both in the community and among officers that come with cameras. That's perhaps not a financial cost, but it definitely is a cost for both groups.
You missed the biggest cost. I'm surprised that it went by unstated. Storage, right?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I guess it goes without, and sorry, it doesn't go without saying, we'll say it, the cost of retention, whether it's cloud-based or whether it's on a server, there are real costs with this, and there are issues with retention. Obviously, how long do you retain it? What are the costs associated with that? And again, civil liberties costs associated with retention.
Yeah, I mean, the storage costs are, I think, what caught a lot of people off guard, and there are any number of jurisdictions, if you just search on the Google, that will describe how jurisdictions abandon their body camera programs, sometimes after acquiring the equipment, because either they realized what the storage costs were, or state law expanded the time for retention of the footage, and they thought, well, we can handle 30 days, but we can't handle 190 days. Do you know what the cameras are costing Tucson in any rough sense? And if not, I'm happy to throw some other.
Hey, why don't you throw that to someone else?
So Scott, do you know what the cameras are costing Tucson?
do you, Scott?
Do you want to, I'm going to show some numbers, but Scott Crouch, who's the CEO of Mark 43, if you want to say anything about the cost, I'm curious.
Yeah, I think there's actually a really interesting one. Can you guys hear me without a microphone? I hate microphones.
But we're live streaming, so.
Sorry. All right, so one of the most important ones I think that's really interesting to note was the cost of redaction that Chief Magnus talked about. And there's actually a more interesting cost of redaction besides literally just the amount you have to pay that, right? Because it's a personnel cost. Departments have limited hiring budgets. They have limited amount of people they can resource on those things, which means that you're taking away people from other projects, right? That could mean you're taking away civilians from other critical functions in the department. And in a lot of cases, it also means you're taking officers off the street. Because these departments don't have enough of a budget to hire civilians, it means that you have sworn personnel in a lot of cases that, should be out there doing some of these tasks, which actually then limits your kind of, your strength on the ground to do patrol, to investigate crimes, and I think that is a very real cost. I think the second thing, too, is that, especially what Barry said, is that there is a very overinflated cost on the storage. You look at what Amazon charges, and it's pennies, right, for stuff like this, and I think that it has been magnified in this industry and that the storage costs are just actually way more than they need to be, based on the amount of video, even though it's substantial in our departments, that actually needs to go up there in the cloud. And so I think there does need to be cheaper solutions out there to actually make it a lot more cost effective for departments to manage this video.
So let's look at some numbers. I'm going to show you some numbers with an apology, which is, You know, it's the details that will kill you in anything that you do, and so we've worked on this convening for a long time. Nothing took more time than trying to figure out what the numbers look like for the cost of body cameras, and part of that's because the pricing models just changed dramatically very quickly, and so you see estimates that turn out to be wrong. But what we tried to do was just sort of average across some jurisdictions that we found and get a sense of what things cost. And we've got the cameras and the hardware. Sometimes departments buy them, sometimes they lease them. I'm not always exactly sure why that choice is made the way it was. I'd be leasing, but I may be missing something. The video storage is extremely expensive. Then there are these costs for redaction, for dealing with FOIA requests, where you see, and I'm going to show you some sort of bigger, harder numbers in just a moment, wildly disparate estimates. So a lot of departments will estimate the cost of the camera and storage. For example, Axon, and I don't know if he's here yet, but Mike Wagers is here from Axon, will give you the camera in a package that includes, you know, all the storage for the month for an officer, and you think, well, that's the amount, but that's not nearly the amount because of all of the personnel that are required to deal with the body cameras. And by the way, it's not just the departments, it's also prosecutor's office, it's defense counsel, it's a lot of, you'll see these costs in a minute. So we tried to look at some jurisdictions where we had some hard figures. So Chicago's spending about $5.5 million a year, LA $6 million. Nashville has opted for a model where it's just going to buy the cameras and handle the storage itself, and is looking at outlays of about 15 to 20 million up front, plus these wildly large numbers for personnel, which either are inflated or are Nashville being estimated. So, you know, I was going to say, that's a big number. Is it worth it? And we're going to talk about whether it's worth it. But I actually don't know whether it's a big number. And I don't know how to know whether it's a big number. So do you have a sense, based on your budget, Chris, of, you know, the amount that you're spending? Is it something that detains, like it's a lot of money, and so this is a choice we're making, or is it just not part of that calculation?
No, it is. The challenge is, I mean, we're a lower income community, really an impoverished community with a very limited budget. And so even with grants from, you know, the DOJ that have allowed, you know, a lot of these purchases, the retention costs for, and the cost of the redaction, that is, I don't think that can be, Scott's right on the money. That's really a huge cost, and it takes time away from other things. So time that we would, you know, we're backlogged as it is with public records requests, and then you have the costs of doing this now, which are astronomical.
So, and this is, I'm going to move away from you and turn to the others on the panel, but I mean, there must be some a priori judgment that you make that, you know, from your time in Richmond or in Tucson, that there's this big number, but the cost is worth it. Is that an intuitive sense that it's worth it?
Well, I mean, look, let's just be honest about it. I think it's very hard at this point in time to find too many communities where there just isn't an expectation that police are going to have cameras. There are a few that are able to hold out for whatever reason, but by and large, I think it is a community expectation. I hear it from the electeds, I certainly hear it from the electeds, and I hear it from community groups of all types. It's almost a given at this point that that's something you're going to have.
I mean, I'm just going to flag that, which is what you might have said was, this is important and our intuitive sense is that it's worth it. It's an interesting answer when the country has moved itself very quickly to, you have to have it, without us actually being sure if it's paying off. So let's start to talk about that. I want to just start with a question for Max Kapustin from Crime Lab, which is, you know, if we're going to think about cost-benefit analysis, which you notice right away is, on the cost side, you have a real number. It's millions. And on the benefit side, you have a lot of words. And so if you want to do cost-benefit analysis, and one of the lessons that I hope we get from the day is, there's cost-benefit analysis that's just going to happen in a command staff room or in a mayor's office or in a city manager's office, which, you know, I'd like to encourage everybody to realize the obvious, which is you could do it with a pen and paper in 2 columns. Or you can do some sophisticated social science to get those numbers much harder. But Max, what do you do, or how do you think about it when the situation you've got is, you got a number on one side and then you've got let me call them aspirations or hope potential benefits on the other?
That's a good question. And I think that making those benefits, making those aspirations into something concrete is something that fortunately a lot of researchers and a lot of policymakers, local governments are very actively trying to do. And the sort of depressing answer in some sense is that given how important public safety is as a public priority, given how much it costs, how much it's regressive in its impact, that it seems to affect kind of our most disadvantaged communities first and foremost, there isn't a lot of great evidence on the benefits of a number of police tactics or technologies or other interventions. We're talking about body-worn cameras right now, and we're fortunate that there have been some very recent studies of very high quality, including the evaluation in Washington, D.C. recently. But if I'm a mid-sized police department and I'm looking to this body of evidence, calling it a body of evidence is probably being a little bit generous. There's been like 3 or 4 studies. How do I know whether that evidence translates to my department? I may not be a coastal city. I'm not going to be something the size of the Metropolitan Police Department, which is unique in a variety of ways, given the kind of tasks that the DC Police Force is tasked with doing. So how do I know whether this is actually going to work? And I think that the slightly less depressing answer is that we live in an era where data is more available than it's ever been, and there are researchers out there who are willing to partner with those policymakers to try to actually get credible estimates of whether those benefits that are listed up there would actually be realized from any of these policies. So, the Arnold Foundation, for example, has now funded policy labs similar to the crime lab all across the country, from Rhode Island to Texas, from Colorado to Georgia, who are very eager to partner with, let's say, police departments to better understand what is the actual impact of these body-worn cameras, recognizing that they may not be the same in a Nashville as they are in a Washington, D.C., and start to actually get estimates of the impact on all those things that are listed up there. And then from that point, you can start to think about how to actually put a dollar value on some of these benefits, particularly some of the more intangible ones like transparency and accountability.
Good. Just one last question for you, and then I'm sure Harlan and Wesley are chomping at the bit. So, or I hope you are. If not, it'll be kind of a flat morning. So, I just say one word about break-even analysis, just because I think it's useful for people to understand that there's a way to at least think about things when you've got a number on one side and you don't have a number on the other.
Sure. So break-even analysis essentially is just saying, look, we know how much the body-worn cameras cost. At least we can, for any given department, maybe these ranges are a little bit alarming, but we can figure out how much it costs to lease these cameras, to do the training, to do the storage, et cetera. How do we actually put a dollar value on the benefits and see if we break even or even come out ahead? I'll just use it as an example, step away for a moment from body-worn cameras and just think about how would you put a value on reducing gun violence, something that's near and dear to my heart. You might take the approach where you go and you try to actually tally up all the different costs of gun violence. What's the lost productivity? What are the medical costs? And you can go about that and you can get a number that way. A different approach that we sometimes see used in social science is called contingent valuation. So this is less about figuring out the cost of a crime that occurred, a given shooting, let's say, that occurred, and figuring out what is the cost of avoiding a particular crime. So you would ask people in a survey, how much would you pay to reduce gun violence by 30%? And based on those results, you'd be able to put a dollar value on the sort of the all-in costs, which includes things that are very, very hard to price individually, like how much would you pay to not have to worry about your kids playing outside and being caught in a crossfire? You could imagine doing something analogous with body-worn cameras. How much would you pay, for example, to have fewer uses of force by police officers in your city, or fewer citizen complaints? You can imagine getting some dollar values on some of those somewhat more intangible items on the left of that column, and start to see, given the rigorous evidence on how much these body-worn cameras reduce use of force, reduce citizen complaints, does it actually pass a cost-benefit test? Do the benefits outweigh the costs?
Good, thanks. So we have a list of benefits. We have some sense of costs. Some of them are hard costs. Now we get to the magic moment, which is to ask Harlan and Wesley, and I think I'll start with Wesley and then move to Harlan, if that's okay, but if you guys feel strongly, you go in the other order. Are we getting the benefits for the costs? One thing I struggle to find, and failed, but would be interesting, would be like a national number on what we're spending on body cameras, but I think it's pretty ginormous. And so are we getting these things that we hope that we're getting from body cameras? I can't even remember who I said would go first now.
Well, I think I can jump in a little bit here. And I do think it would be great if we did have those national numbers. We don't, not necessarily. I think that, as is the case across so many when we talk about data and information and policing, that we've got 19,000 different departments handling this 19,000 different ways, and that many of us spend infinite amounts of time trying to tally up the closest thing we can get to totals to try to get understandings of this, but it's still a little difficult. I mean, we know that at this point, most policing jurisdictions have cameras on at least some of their officers, which is a drastic difference from 2013 or 2014. But what we also know is that while in groups like this, we often talk about best practices and about how policy should be best implemented. Much as is the case with almost any type of policing policy, every department is doing it a little bit differently, and that there are lessons that have been learned in some places that have yet to be learned in others or have been actively resisted in others. And so gauging the overall benefit and whether it's being realized everywhere, I think can be difficult, and in fact can be stilted a little bit because you have places that won't institute some of these. And so, for example, we were talking earlier about, and I think the chief made a really important point about the presence of the camera not necessarily guaranteeing a trust nor guaranteeing an accountability. It's a tool that opens a door for a potential level of increased accountability, which then in turn opens a door to potentially having increased amounts of trust. When I had a colleague, Kimberly Kindy, who did a study in 2015 in a post-Ferguson world as cameras were kind of proliferating. And what we found was that there had been, in 2016, there had been twice as many police shootings captured on a body-worn camera. But that was not because there was an increased number of police shootings, rather it was because of an increased number of cameras. But that said, in the vast majority of those cases, the family, much less the public, the family of the person killed in the shooting, much less the public, had never been given access to the video. While in most cases, departments have policies which allow an officer involved in one of these critical instances to view the video prior. Now, there's a debate to be had about where exactly that policy should be, when this video should become public, when perhaps someone involved in that incident should have the right to see it, much less the officer themselves. But what we know is that it varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so if I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, it's going to be different than if I drive up the road to Cleveland Heights, Ohio. And so what we're still seeing is that, as I said earlier, the cameras are tools, and the tools can work in one of two directions, right? That the presence of the video, the presence of the camera opens the idea of a promise that we might be able to see what happened. But in a jurisdiction or in an incident in which that video is then either concealed or kept from the public, it can in fact only double down on a distrust or a mistrust. And we've seen this even in very prominent cases, right? That 2 years after the shooting of Alton Sterling, the Baton Rouge police released new body camera videos. Well, this was a shooting that had prompted thousands of people in the streets and at times violent protests. Officers have been shot. And years after the fact, the public finds out there's additional video evidence. And so I do think that there's a real push and pull. Beyond that, also, speaking of policy and training, right, it seems at least once or twice a year at a national stage, we have to have a conversation where we re-explain how the 30-second delay on the audio works on the body cameras, right? Where the public doesn't necessarily know that. In some cases, folks even working with the cameras don't fully know or grasp that. It raises the specter of you're watching a video and you realize, wait, they didn't turn the camera on until after they shot the guy, and the only reason we can see it is because of the 30-second catch. That was the case with Keith Lamont Scott in Charlotte, another prominent national case. And so again, this tool raises the possibility that it can further distrust, because what the camera does is it just captures a reality. When we started putting so many cameras on officers, there was, in some spaces, the impression that this would be exonerating. Well, what we're going to see is all this video. It's going to prove that nothing bad's happening, and we very quickly realized that wasn't exactly going to be the case.
I just want to put a point on it, and I'm going to turn to Harlan. And by the way, I should have said this. Wesley's at the Washington Post, and the Post has been involved in two really fascinating studies. The first was the one that brought our attention to the fact that the number of reported police shootings was much less than the number of actual police shootings, now working on a project to sort of track clearance rates around homicides in different jurisdictions in the country. But to put a point on it, what I hear you saying is we're investing an enormous amount in cameras. The point of it is transparency. The hope is that if you get transparency, then there will be trust. But actually, if what happens is we put the camera on the officer and we don't get transparency, we've spent all the money to hurt trust rather than to help trust. Is that?
Certainly. Well, but you have that, and then beyond that, transparency is only as good as what you are showing people, right? If I hand my girlfriend my cell phone and say, go through it, well, that's transparency, but that could either hurt or harm trust depending on what's in my phone. And so again, the cameras are a tool, and they further illuminate the reality of what's happening in these relationships. And so cameras absent policy, cameras absent training, cameras absent actual relationships between the officers and the communities are only going to show us more videos of bad shootings or more videos of bad interactions, and then now we all get to see them. And I mean, I hear that sometimes when I was out with a department a few weeks ago, and one thing they kept talking about was they said we haven't had a viral incident, but when I walk into our public housing project on a call, the person I'm interacting with was just sitting inside their house watching YouTube videos of cops other places beating up people, right? The idea that and you hear this sometimes from jurisdictions, that it flattens the experience in some ways, and that a bad incident in one jurisdiction or in one place does ricochet across the country in a way that it perhaps didn't have the likelihood or the possibility of doing as frequently previously because of these cameras.
We're going to talk about some of the studies, but one of the interesting ones was I was curious whether there had been any studies of community trust. So it's one thing to study some of the aspects of body cameras that are easier to count, and that's a lesson about social science. But Aaron Carrison, who's now at the Center for Policing Equity, and I saw Phil Goff here from CPE, hi Phil, did an interesting study in Baltimore where they interviewed people about how the body camera footage made them feel. And folks said what you've said here, which is, if what you see is every time you turn on the television, there's video of police shooting another person of color, it's completely disconcerting and discouraging and isn't helping build trust at all. So that's worthwhile. I've kept Harlan waiting a long time because I know he has almost nothing to say about body cameras or body camera policy. But Harlan, are we getting out of the body cameras what we need and want?
I think I want to start by challenging the assertion that we have a number even on one side of the ledger, on the cost side of the ledger. We've been focusing here so far on literal cost to police departments, cost to taxpayers in purchasing and deploying and operationalizing these programs. But we haven't really talked very much about the social cost, right? The cost to communities of having these cameras. And I think I'll also say that, and this is true across policing, one person's benefit is another person's cost, right? More policing in some cases, in some kinds of, low-level, for low-level drug crimes, is a benefit for some, but a cost for others, and for some communities and not for others. And so I think we just need to be careful when we talk about costs and benefits that we're looking at the big picture. Some of the costs that, I worry about, that groups that I work together with worry about, is the increased cost of surveillance, right? Vendors are thinking about adding face recognition to these cameras, which would really change the cost-benefit analysis of what we're getting. We haven't thought about the cost in terms of how body-worn cameras change what happens in the courtroom, right? To the extent that policies allow officers to watch the footage before they write the reports, that changes the game in terms of what happens with witnesses, especially officer witnesses in the courtroom, and how that might change outcomes. And so there's, I think, a wider range of costs than we're considering right here. Also say that, we also talk about studies. Max talked about how we might be able to put.
Wait, Harlan, I just want to interrupt you
Yeah.
for just 1 second to pursue something you said, because I think, sometimes you could think about something as being on the benefit or the cost side, not just from a perspective, but an unfurthered benefit might itself turn into a cost. But so part of what you're saying, and I just don't let me put words in your mouth or do, is that that if you have this list of benefits of things you want to achieve, but it turns out that we're not getting the transparency, but we are using the body cameras, in fact, to further criminal prosecutions, then in fact what's happening is the calculus is changing pretty dramatically, because you may not be getting the transparency or trust. You may be getting some benefit from, if you think it's a benefit, from more criminal prosecutions, but that things can shift from either side of that ledger pretty easily.
Depends on who you ask.
Good. You were about to say something about policy.
Yeah, I mean, I was also going to say, you know, we've been also touching on the benefits, and a lot of the benefits I think are still unproven. Max brought up the DC body-worn camera study. So this was a randomized controlled trial with pretty rigorous methodology, the largest study of body-worn cameras to date in a major police department. And what the study showed was that there was no statistically significant difference between cops that wore cameras and didn't wear cameras on use of force, on the number of complaints, and on officer behavior. And what frustrated me about that, so great that they did the study. I'm all for doing more empirical studies like this, especially with rigorous methodology. But what frustrated me is, you know, even after doing this study, what actually changed on the policy side? How did this actually change what the DC Police Department was doing? And, you know, we, held some community meetings after the study was done. And, you know, even though the Metropolitan Police Department said, you know, yes, we see, you know, we understand the results of these studies, we're still going to keep the cameras because, and then they fell back on vague notions of we think it increases trust, which is a thing that's now unmeasured, right? We measured the thing, and it didn't really feed into changes in the way that the program was operating. So, you know, I'll also point out that, you know, structurally for a lot of these studies, we're really measuring and studying the technology in a way, but in a very limited sense, in that we're not testing different policies, right? We take the DC MPD policy as a given, and then we see whether it has, whether it changes use of force or complaints. But we don't test whether different policies might lead to different outcomes, right? You can imagine a policy where the officer gets to turn their cameras on and off as they wish. They could even delete footage as they wish, and no one in the public gets to see the footage. One policy. On the other side, cameras are on all the time, and a third party holds all the footage and gets to decide, or maybe it just makes it all public, right? Depending on what the policy is, it's gonna change officer behavior. But we never study and test cost and benefits and the effects of body-worn cameras by varying the different policies that might be in place. And the last thing I'll say is that, one of the things that Upturn and together with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights have done is a body-worn camera scorecard, where we've looked at 75 major police departments across the country and all of the policies that have been put into place and evaluated those policies across a set of 8 civil rights criteria. And what we've found is nationwide that body-worn camera policies largely advantage the interests of departments and their officers, and don't advantage or prioritize the interests of those in the community around, when officers can watch footage, around when the footage eventually gets released to the public.
Still behind your back is the part of the scorecard that Upturn and the Leadership Conference did on body-worn cameras, and what is startling to look at that, and this is just a small part of the scorecard, it scrolls to many, many cities, is you get pretty bad marks on the one thing I'd have guessed was the most important part of body cameras, which is access to the footage. Now, what Upturn and the Leadership Conference were looking at here was, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Harlan, access to footage by the people who had a complaint and or were caught on the footage.
The subject of the footage.
Right. And, what they're not measuring is the laws that permit disclosure to the media. And there, the laws are all over the map. North Carolina passed a law that basically restricts access, says this isn't a public record, and the public can't see it unless somebody goes to court and a judge decides. I don't know whether you're thinking, well, good, a judge of all people, decides whether it's in the public interest to reveal it, whereas California, actually building on some work that Los Angeles did that We the Policing Project helped with, has passed a law that requires that there's a presumption within 45 days the footage will be available, but you're going to get dramatically different reflections on your cost-benefit analysis, depending upon which of those policies gets adopted. I want to talk more about policy, but first, Scott, because we were talking about this last night, were our expectations just off the charts wrong when we went into this body camera frenzy?
You know, I'm not really sure about that, but when you think about law enforcement technology, right, you should think about its benefits under 3 categories. So the first is, does it make the lives of the officers and the people in departments easier, right? And so by that I mean better workflows, you know, better efficiencies, more time for them to do other jobs. You want them to have, you know, more efficient patrolling, more efficient investigative work, more time for crime analysis, and better access to data. The second one is improved officer safety, right? So can you actually give them access to the information that's going to allow the officers to be safer on the streets? And the third is, does it allow them to better serve their community? And there's a lot in there, right? So part of it's reducing crime. The other part of it is protecting privacy and transparency too, right? And so I think that those are all really important facets when you look at law enforcement technology. And you know, I've been doing that for the last 6 years, building it, of my life since college. And what we've seen is that you really can't discount the third thing, because that's going to govern a lot of the policies that you put in place. And from our experience just in implementing software over the last 6 years, you know, we've worked with phenomenal departments, and we're absolutely really lucky to do it. And one of the things we've seen is that, you know, 70% is the technology and 30% is the policies you put in place. And I think that's really key, right? Because not only is that going to govern how you use it, but it's also going to make it a lot more effective if you have great policies to actually back up how it's being implemented. And so, you know, that's now, you know, when we started implementing, you know, I mean, I was 21 when we started doing that, so we didn't really know. We've actually made that a large part of our process, is actually from the beginning working with departments and saying, all right, at the same time as we're doing this implementation, let's work with you guys to build the policies. And that's not just a group of officers, right? That is their command staff, that's patrol detectives, it's people from their, you know, internal privacy, it's people from internal affairs, and it's also in some cases outside groups too. And you know, we leave that to the discretion of the department. But when you have really kind of this multifaceted, diverse group of people working on policies around that, it actually makes the implementation a lot more effective. And so, you know, I think with respect to body cameras, you know, we've worked with a lot of departments, and the intention from those departments is really good, right, when they're going into those. I've seen a lot of chiefs, I've seen a lot of command staff who are like, we're doing this to build trust in the community, but to also make sure that, you know, you can protect your officers at the same time. And I do believe both are very possible with body cameras. I think there is value there. And so, you know, while I would say that, you know, some policy needs to be refined, and this is the last thing I'll say, it does have a benefit. And I do think, you know, and, you know, Harlan and I were talking, there is a lot of policy around there too that's going to make it a lot more effective, and actually I think more beneficial for both the community and the officers at the same time.
So I just want to summarize what seems like one of the clearest and most important things that we can all learn, which is that when you proceed with something and you think, why am I doing this? You know, is there a problem that I'm trying to solve, that the city's trying to solve, the department's trying to solve? What are our good intentions? And then you think about the costs. You actually have to have the policy in place to maximize those benefits and minimize the costs. And if you just plunge in, then you're going to end up disappointed. And, you know, I guess I want to ask I'm going to state the obvious and not ask it as a question, and then I want to talk about unintended consequences, which is, I would have thought that the one thing, and I'm going to make this point about body cameras because I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to think about other things in policing where we haven't been as deliberative. I mean, we've been as deliberative about body cameras as just about anything in democracy. In my book Unwarranted, when I talk about policing, I say, you know, we have this absence of democratic accountability around policing except body cameras. It seems like every hamlet and village and town and city in America had a committee that was going to decide what would happen with body cameras. And yet, despite all that intentionality, you'd think that the one thing we'd need from body cameras to make them be worth the cost was transparency, because that's what everybody was hoping to get. And yet, so many of the policies fell down on that ground, and that's actually pretty startling. I want to ask a question about unintended consequences just because I'm interested in it, and then I'm going to also ask a question about other aspects of policing where we should be thinking about this. So there are these studies that are coming out about body cameras. They sometimes seem to reach very different results about whether it lowers use of force, about whether it lowers complaints. I'm going to at some point, hopefully have time to ask Carlin and Max how to think about those when we have policies pointing in different directions. But one of the most interesting findings to me in the studies that I've read was a finding that in some jurisdictions, like Phoenix and like in Las Vegas, even if recorded uses of force go down or complaints about officers go down, enforcement actions go up. There are more summons issued. There are more arrests issued. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that I heard any discussion at the front end of body cameras where people said, we're predicting that. So I'm curious for thoughts from the panel about why we're seeing that. I've been able to come up with 2 reasons, but I don't know that I'm remotely right. And then the other question I want to ask is, if we had thought through it in a greater depth, might we have anticipated this? Anybody have a thought or reaction as to why we're seeing that?
So, I mean, the hypothesis about why investigations go up is when officers would typically use their discretion, right, and not arrest somebody or not press charges or take the context into question. Many officers now feel more constrained, right, that they have to follow the letter of the law, what's on the books, or else their supervisors will, discipline them. So that's at least the hypothesis. But I think fundamentally, it comes down to the question, when we put policies in place around body cams in particular, is, are these tools for transparency, or are these tools for investigations? And I think in many places, the policies, the front matter, the purpose will talk about transparency and accountability, but ultimately what happens, especially when the public can't even get footage after critical incidents, or there aren't any policies in place that mandate that departments release footage after critical incidents, what we're really getting are investigatory tools and surveillance tools.
I agree about officers feeling that they don't have as much discretion, but I think a way to address that is to clearly state in policy when discretion should be exercised. So in Baltimore, for example, we are revising our policies under the federal consent decree on stops and when officers should issue citations as opposed to arresting individuals for low-level offenses. With a clear policy of when that should happen, even if it's caught on video, the officer, if they're trained on the policy and on the use of body-worn cameras, the officers should still feel comfortable using their discretion. So that's just one way to get around the increase in enforcement.
So
I just want to, I think Monique is exactly right. It comes down to policy, training, and culture in a department. I don't think it has to be a function of, I don't think this necessarily has to be an outcome of body cameras. We've not found that to be at all the case in our agency. Enforcement in terms of whether it's writing tickets or making an arrest have not gone up as a result of the body cameras, but we have a very strong culture around the appropriateness of discretion, and we're even incorporating that now around the issue of deflection for individuals with small amounts of pocket drugs, the idea of pre-arrest deflection. That's being done, and it's being done with body cameras. So I think it's more about the policy and the culture and what first-line supervisors want and expect rather than just having a piece of technology.
I'll just point out one other place where policies seems to have mattered a great deal, which is there's this interesting study and then a reevaluation by Ariel Barak and co-authors that basically looked at 10 jurisdictions and found that across them there was no change in use of force. But in reality, when you picked it apart, some jurisdictions' use of force went up, and in some jurisdictions' use of force went down, and they were puzzled by that and asked why that would be the case. And when they went back and looked more closely, what they found was that in the jurisdictions that had very clear rules about when the camera was to go on, and officers followed those rules, use of force went down. But where those rules were not clear and officers exercised their discretion, use of force went up. And partly their hypothesis by the end of that was because if the officer turned on the camera and announced it to everybody on the front end, everybody understood the camera was rolling. If in the middle of an incident where people might already have gotten into a heated position, the officer then put on the camera, it just escalated the situation. And so it's just another example of how. And one of the points is we just need to learn from policy. Nobody's going to get it all right at the beginning, but they've got to constantly be testing. I want to open it up to the panel and ask this question, and then I actually think we have time to get some questions from the floor, which I had not expected, and I don't even know if we have microphones. But so the lesson I'd like to take away from this, and I think Maria's been uncovering a set of questions that we've want you to ask, and I don't even remember what the last two are. We're going to hand everybody a card after this session that has the 10 questions we want everybody to ask as police departments make decisions. I'll actually tell you what the last two, there they are. So the question I want to ask is, there's been a lot of forethought about body cameras, and still there's genuine concern that we've spent a lot of money on something that's not giving us the benefits that we wanted and having some perverse effects. The thing we hope you all take away from the day here is that doing this kind of thinking on the front end can fundamentally change policing. So the question I have for you is, can any of you think, and in fact maybe we'll just start at one end of the table and move down it, of some aspect of policing where this kind of front end thinking didn't happen and where things might not, and by the way, it could be something that's already occurred or something we're thinking about, because Harlan mentioned facial recognition, where if we were to think through it, we might have ended up in a very different place. So I'm just curious. Max, you want to jump in?
Sure. I'll take what I hope is a low-hanging fruit. The Pentagon's 1033 program, this is the military surplus program where local police departments could acquire equipment that the military no longer needed. Mm-hmm. I haven't directly spoken to any police chiefs or city managers about the rationale for obtaining that equipment at the outset when they did. I would wonder if some of the smaller jurisdictions that obtained this equipment really thought through both the benefits of doing that, what they would actually gain, as well as the reputational costs that they might suffer from the public seeing that equipment being used.
Good. I'm just going to shout out Tom Clark and Mila Owens, who are out there somewhere from Emory, who are, and Ender Gunderson, I think, is the third author, who are working with us on some projects around militarization to try to both see whether there are crime-fighting effects, but also what the social costs are. Do you want to go, Harlan? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of the technologies that you rattled off at the beginning of the panel, right, have not been well thought out, certainly not democratically debated in terms of what the costs and benefits are and whether communities even want that, right? That includes, stingrays, predictive policing, automated license plate readers, Cellebrite and Gray key devices to break device encryption, and things like that. And so I think one great initiative that's happening across the country is the ACLU's CCOPS initiative, Community Control of Police Surveillance, where this would hand control back to communities to require meetings and deliberation around a lot of these new technologies.
Good.
So I'll go back even further to say I think 911 is a good example of process and a lot of technology that has not really been thought through in terms of its implication of how cops do their jobs. The idea that you call for anything and you get a police officer, just a matter of how long you wait for one, is not a good way to do policing. And we're finally starting to look at this. We're doing some work, as is Camden, with the Vera Institute, supported by Arnold Foundation, to look at the role of how calls are triaged, if calls could be handled differently, how we can free officers up to do more proactive, community-engaged work and just respond to calls better and more effectively, and 911 has not really provided that.
I hope everybody in the room understands that the game is obviously to say Arnold Foundation just as often as one possibly can. I'm just going to mention briefly facial rec, because I think this is facial rec and artificial intelligence have lots of exciting possible uses, but the idea of putting facial rec on body cameras is one that troubles me. It's not that you couldn't imagine some use case where I think we could develop a policy that would make the benefits be worth the costs, but but there's a strange tension, which is the benefit has to be from recognizing and catching people that are out there that you wouldn't catch otherwise. I think that's probably pretty random and probabilistic. You'll catch more people the more people you put into your database. So if your database is just sort of Amber Alerts, that's a small group of people. If it's anybody with an outstanding warrant, that's a ginormous number of people. And the more that you expand that group, then you're going to be basically, I fear, undercutting the transparency and trust that you hope to get out of the body camera in the very first place.
So I'm not going to talk about equipment. I want to focus on training, and this is something I mentioned to you, Barry, a few years ago, is just how training impacts the amount of payout in civil lawsuits that cities provide to victims of police misconduct. So, the city budget is paying for law enforcement agencies and all the equipment and personnel that they need, and they're also paying, civil litigation. And so that's a cost and benefit analysis I would love to see, and would be interested in knowing a little bit more about how we can do some savings in that area.
Good, Wesley.
Certainly. Among many things that come to mind is the post-Columbine push for school resource officers, and more broadly, kind of the marrying of our policing system and our education system in that way. That what we've now seen in terms of the number of students and children who are entering the criminal justice system because they are being arrested for getting in a fight in a hallway instead of being sent to detention, much less than, we've seen some use of force incidents occurring inside elementary and middle schools because similar to the idea of, I talk about this all the time in terms of 911, right? That we societally have decided the only way to solve any problem, be that problem your son has run away from home or someone is sticking you up, is to insert typically men with guns. The idea that we would insert those men with guns into our elementary schools only raises the specter of those men using the guns or any other type of force. And so I do think that the creation of many of these school police departments, much less the resource officers, in many jurisdictions, post-Columbine was extremely well-intentioned, but I think we certainly have seen collateral consequences to that.
Scott?
I'll speak from my perspective as a software CEO in the space. I think that departments need to do a better job of holding their vendors to higher standards. And people don't realize that a lot of the problems that exist here is because there's so much legacy old software in this space that it's actually hurting a lot of the efforts of the police departments to be transparent, right? Because you need to ask your vendors for, an open platform standard. You need to make sure they're not holding your data hostage, and they need to be able to easily access it. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a meeting with a police department and I've asked, how do you guys currently get access to this data? And they said, we can't. It's really hard. It's really difficult to get access of this. You literally have police departments that have software programming teams who are running database scripts to get access to their information. And so I think that, not only do the police departments have a responsibility here, but the vendors have a responsibility, and they need to step up and commit to that responsibility too.
Good. So I just want to say something in summary and then see if there are any questions, which is, it is very common in the fraught world that often involves policing for there to be finger pointing and certainty that there's venality behind things that happen when often there's, as Wesley just pointed out, unintentionality. I think it was Eric Severide who once said the chief cause of problems is solutions. And so, we think that there's a problem in the world. We want to jump to solve it. That's admirable in its own way. But if we don't stop and pause and think about solving that problem, and do something as simple as taking a pad of paper and drawing a line down the middle and trying to think in advance what are the costs and what are the benefits, then we end up with unintended consequences that some we can't anticipate and we can try to change on the fly, but others that we actually could anticipate and then try to design policies and ways around so that we do get the benefits of things like new technologies while minimizing the impact. I think we have time for a couple questions if there are folks that want to ask anything. Yeah, sure, go ahead. Say who you are and ask loudly, and I'll repeat it for the live stream.
Alex Vitale from Brooklyn College. Harlan, you mentioned third-party control of the footage, which is something I've been calling for working. You mentioned third-party control over the footage, which is something I think might be a way to go with this. So I'm curious what what you and some of the other panelists think about that in terms of reducing the potential costs in terms of surveillance, privacy, evidence collection, et cetera.
I mean, I think overall it's a great idea, right? Especially if body-worn cameras are supposed to be transparency and accountability tools, that would be an ideal setup. But the reality is that police departments, these are police department budgets, they buy and control the cameras and the footage. And I don't know, maybe other folks on the panel have thoughts about how you might be able to change that overall dynamic.
Hearing none, we'll take another question. Yep, Arif.
My name is Arif Ali Khan. My name is Arif Ali Khan. I'm the Director of Constitutional Policing and Policy at LAPD, a little department on the West Coast. I just want to say, you'd mentioned about the expectations of body-worn video, and especially on this premise that by being transparent, it would build trust. And the thing that's always interested me is this, it's been this idea that this is a brand new technology and this will revolutionize policing, and yet ignores a vast amount of data and experience that policing has had with video in police contacts, which are dash cams and digital in-car video, in which literally millions of interactions have been recorded, some for over 30 years, back when VHS tapes were made. And yet there has been no study or very limited studies about that experience, and very little evidence to suggest that in those types of encounters, which are the vast majority of police public encounters in which you have deadly force situations, unfortunately quite frequently, that it has increased public trust or that it has reduced uses of force. And in many states where video for that has been disclosed for decades. So I do think that this idea of this assumption that we kind of rushed into was going to yield these results. But I also want to say that some of the unintended benefits are actually good for policing. And one thing that wasn't listed on there that's very important from an organizational perspective is oftentimes when we have these incidents, the department itself doesn't know what happened. People think that the LAPD will know immediately what happened in the encounter. We're restricted from even interviewing the officer until several hours later, some jurisdictions a week later. And for us to actually know what happened is a very big challenge. Now that we have at least some evidence, and then we can say with some confidence what happened, we can do that earlier and inform the public, which is a benefit that I think is really important. But one of the costs, and this is my actual question for all of you, is nobody's looking at what is the cost to the victims of crime. And in their hesitation to come forward and report crimes because of being recorded and the potential that their face is going to be out in the public. That is especially important in communities like Los Angeles with a very large undocumented population, especially given the current political rhetoric. And that, to me, is one of the biggest concerns of law enforcement. Because if rape victims, assault victims, victims of extortion, et cetera, are hesitant to call the police, that, to me, is a huge tragedy. So I'd like to get your thoughts on
Does
that.
anybody know if there's been a study that's looked at that? I haven't seen one that's looked at that. I'm actually going to use Arif's question as a segue to get everybody to a break, but I want to give clear instructions about that, which is, the lesson I think we want you to take away from this panel is you can do this at home. Like, every department ought to be thinking this way all the time about the decisions that it's going to make of any moment. But there are also complicated things that we need to learn, and we need social science to do that, and the next panel is going to show us how, because the question you raise, Arif, doesn't strike me as a complicated thing to study, and somebody ought to do it. It requires social scientists who are interested, it requires some funding, but and it requires cooperation between departments and social scientists, but I think that in and of itself is a hugely important thing that Chris often talks about. So we'll leave you with that. We're going to have a break. During the break, we're going to hand everybody a card that's got these 10 questions that we hope you'll take home to your local departments and your local city managers and mayors and use as citizens. And then I want to warn you, which is that when we bring you back from the break, we're going to go for 2 hours. So now would be a good time to use the facilities if facilities are what you need. Thank you very much to everyone.
Okay, it's finally quieted down a little in here. It's an amazing group of people, and I only wish I had more time to actually be chatting with more of you, but I'm looking forward to doing that after this panel is over. So I'm Maria Ponomarenko, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Policing Project, and I have been overseeing some of our cost-benefit work. So the goal of the last panel, as Barry alluded to, was to show that As a first cut, if you have a pen and paper, you can do cost-benefit analysis. Even just sitting down and writing what you think you want to accomplish, what you think the costs are going to be, and thinking about whether you actually have the policies in place to maximize those benefits and minimize those costs, that already would be a pretty substantial change from how a lot of decisions around criminal justice policy tend to be made. But now we want to pivot a little bit and talk about what the next step might be and whether we can actually start to put some tangible values on both the benefits and costs. And the focus of this panel is going to be on traffic stops, and in particular, some of the work that the Policing Project and our partners have been doing to assess the efficacy and some of the downstream costs of traffic stops and using traffic stops as a strategy to fight crime. And the project that we've been working on has been in partnership with the Nashville Police Department, and we've been very fortunate to have both the police department and the mayor's office very excited to do this work and to learn from it. And so joining me today, we have Chief Hagar, who is the Deputy Chief of the Nashville Police Department. And he's been the one who's spearheaded a lot of this work within the department and has been a great supporter of it. We also have Bob Haas, who's the former Commissioner of Police in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and has been working with us in Nashville and in Chicago on our various projects. We have, I'm going to see, I'm trying to think the order, Shard Gold, and sorry, I just realized Bob and Mike, you guys are not in the order I was expecting you to be in. We have Shard Gold, who's an assistant professor at Stanford University and also the founder and executive director of the Computational Policy Lab. He and his team have been doing a lot of the data work with us in Nashville, and we're really grateful for all of their work. Linda Garcia from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is not working with us directly on this project, though is a wonderful partner on other projects that we have going. But Linda has done a lot of work both at the Leadership Conference and in her previous role at the Department of Justice in communities where there have been concerns about traffic stops and other proactive strategies, and so can help provide some national context. And finally, we have Mark Cohen, a professor of law and business at Vanderbilt University, who also has been working with us in Nashville and has done some pioneering work in trying to put values on intangible costs like the costs of crime or some of the costs of policing. So before turning to substance and to our panelists, I just want to start with a caveat. So when we initially imagined this panel, what we'd hoped to do was show off all of the work that our social science partners have done in Nashville. But as often is the case, ambitious plans run into real-world realities, and in this case, the real-world reality is that we would love to present our results to the folks in Nashville first. This is ultimately their project, and they're going to be the ones making this decision, and so we want to make sure that the local stakeholders, from the mayor's office to the department to the communities, get to see these results before we present them to all of you. And so what we're going to do is talk in a little bit more general terms about how we can think about the costs and benefits of traffic stops, how social science can help answer some of those questions, and show you little bits of work both in Nashville and elsewhere. But for the broader report, that should be out sometime later this fall. So with that, I thought I would start, Chief, with you, and you have been super supportive of this work, and I was just wondering if you could say a word about kind of what prompted this project and what prompted the chief and the mayor to reach out.
So I think it was a confluence of events over a period of time, which Nashville has always prided itself on its transparency. On our crime statistics website, we publish traffic stops data, we publish our CompStat books, we publish a wealth of information that the public has traditionally taken very little interest in. Around that time, early 2016, some researchers from Vanderbilt University decided to look at traffic stop data. They contacted us and asked for raw data. We provided that, and we knew they were in the context of preparing a report. Shortly thereafter, there was a controversial shooting in Nashville. Those two things led by the fact that Nashville is a community that enjoys a lot of community support. Around that same time, Vanderbilt produced a report that said the police department enjoyed about 80% community support. The police department has over 600 community groups, conducts over 2,000 community meetings a year. So we kind of assumed that we had a lot of support. This report came out suggesting that through traffic stops, there was significant racial bias in how we were using traffic stops for our policing programs in Nashville. The confluence of those events led to looking at external resources to help us better inform how we assign resources, how we police certain neighborhoods. There were neighborhoods that we had established community groups in and seemed to enjoy a wealth of support from the residents and the resident associations. Yet at the same time, there were activists who used that negative report to try to divide police-community relations and make the suggestion that those communities were being over-policed. So the policing project provided an excellent opportunity for independent research and analysis to help us better inform how we allocate resources, how we try to ensure that all the neighborhoods are policed fairly, how they also feel safe, and that they feel like the services that we were providing to them are legitimate, that we are responsive to their needs along with the rest of the community. And I think the work the policing project has started is a good first step in helping better inform us about what our goals are.
Thanks, Chief. And I have to say, I mean, this has been one of the most receptive departments to work with, so we're kind of grateful to the openness. So I wonder if we can take a step back and just tell us a little about why the department has kind of used stops, or how it's used stops, and what the strategy has been, both under the current chief and kind of prior administrations.
So we have 8 police precincts in Nashville. They range from urban to suburban to very rural. Within those precincts, we have flex teams, which are a group of officers on each shift. The term flex simply refers to flexible. Their shifts may vary, their days off may vary. Those officers are designed to respond to hot spots at a moment's notice. We have CAP officers, crime analysis for patrol officers at each precinct, who help inform those precinct commanders in what the emerging trends are for that day, for that week. One of the tools that those flex officers use are traffic stops. To put that in context, traffic stops in Nashville were at a high about 2012. It was about 500,000 traffic stops in a city that's 533 square miles, population of about 700,000. The traffic stops last year about 245,000, so they've been dropping drastically. But unlike New York, Nashville is not a very pedestrian-friendly city. In its urban core, there's obviously the tourist segment and then the business segment, but in many of these areas, there's not a lot of pedestrian traffic. And traffic stops were a way to engage the public, to reduce violent crime, particularly the efforts in 2016 when a lot of this came to a head were street robberies. The use of a traffic stop in those areas was essentially one of the few tools to actually engage people in those areas. What's significant to note, though, those traffic stops most often do not result in a citation. 75 to 80% result in a warning and what we believe to be a positive community contact. We use those traffic stops to not only warn the offender about what they were stopped for and provide some education, but also to provide an explanation about why we're in the neighborhood, educate them about our neighborhood watch groups, the neighborhood groups in that community. So that was the underlying reason for the stops.
And Bob, you were chief in Cambridge, and you've worked with, I don't know how many departments in various capacities, but it's a pretty long list. And I was wondering if you can just provide a little bit of national context in terms of kind of the strategy of policing generally.
So I'm going to begin by apologizing because I just got my instructions this morning. So it's not as polished as I'd like it to be, but my job is really kind of giving you a very broad overview in terms of how we evolved in policing, what the thinking has been among police leadership, and really with a single purpose. So, I mean, early on, and I'm not going to tell you how long I've been in policing, but it's been quite a while, we were heavily indoctrinated. And I don't think my experience is atypical than what you saw across the nation in terms of the notion that higher police presence, higher active police presence in areas particularly where there's crime and disorder is going to have an impact in terms of reducing crime. So with a single purpose in terms of the way we looked at things, we were looking simply at making communities safer, thinking about how we reduce crimes, and not really understanding fully the collateral impact that it was having on those communities when we were engaging in that kind of activity. So we never looked broadly in terms of thinking about what our role would be or our mission be within the community. And we thought, quite honestly, we were doing a great job. You know, if we were reducing crime, we had the kind of impact we wanted, but never realized that over decades of that kind of policing, it had really deteriorated and then worsened the situation we were experiencing in terms of what our perception was, and Barry talked about this a little bit earlier, what our perception was and what the community perception was. And they're really taking that into account. We did rely upon surveys every once in a while, but we always looked at, you know, if we were in the majority, we were doing a good job, and always forgot about that small minority of population that didn't think we were doing a good job, and didn't see that as our challenge in terms of trying to figure out how do we change that dynamic with respect to really reaching out to that portion of the community that probably was experiencing the most amount of policing, but also having the adverse or reverse effect of its relationship and trust and partnership with the community. So we really didn't see how we were actually having the various communities that we were supposed to be protecting really not having desired outcomes and going forward. So what was interesting with Nashville, I mean, I came from a community early on that was suburban, so we used motor vehicle stops as the principal way of engaging the community and really trying to address issues around the community. And we're told over and over again, just the mere presence and the mere appearance of you being heavily engaged creates this impression, this omnipresence you always heard about policing in communities and how that would make the community safer, and never realized that we had a broader mission or had a broader, should have had a broader impact in terms of thinking about our dimensions. And that's why this whole conversation about cost and benefit analysis is so critical, because we always, and Barry talked about this before, we never took into consideration what kinds of detrimental impacts we were having in our community based on the kind of work that we were doing in terms of going forward.
So to kind of focus on those detrimental impacts, Linda, you've done a lot of work in various communities, and you know, Bob's alluded multiple times now to kind of unintended or collateral consequences of these sorts of strategies, and I was wondering if you can kind of articulate those a bit.
Sure. I mean, I think it's important to start off with the fact that these stops are lawful. The Supreme Court has said that officers can conduct stops even if the supposed reason is a complete pretext for the actual reason that the officer is stopping the person, which is usually to find, you know, evidence of more serious crime. The problem comes in that there are lots of laws governing our movement in public, especially while driving, and this makes it pretty easy for an officer to find a reason to pull someone aside. Because it's the communities that are heavily policed that this happens in the most, it tends to foster huge community mistrust and a lack of willingness to cooperate with police. It's not surprising that the mistrust is highest in the communities that are most heavily policed, and those tend to be communities of color. And during my time at DOJ, we saw this a lot through our investigations. In Baltimore, for example, the DOJ investigation found a pattern of practice of constitutional violations. And there, in 1 year in 2014, the police department had conducted over 400,000 stops in a city with a population of 600,000 people. So you can imagine the impact that that has in the way that those folks are viewing the police. When we were in, or when the DOJ was in Chicago, also spoke to lots of folks, and the years and years of these sorts of practices also had eroded their trust in the police legitimacy. These things are not quantifiable, so you can look at the disparities if you have the data, but you can't really quantify these qualitative things that folks are telling you about. And those social costs are huge. So as I said, there's a cost in terms of the mistrust of government, the criminal justice system, and police. There's an unwillingness to cooperate with police. It can perpetuate a cynicism about the law, which might perpetuate crime and actual victimization, and also a disillusion, really, with our systems, our democratic systems, in that folks take a look around and they ask themselves, is this really what police are supposed to be spending their time doing? And so it's not really a question of whether it's constitutional or not, is this worth it, right? The human and social costs behind it, when folks are left feeling that they're not free from government intrusion, because of the color of their skin or the zip code that they live in. And there's also the cost on the law enforcement side, because law enforcement, they're diverting the resources that they could spend time engaging in more productive activities, such as building community relationships. These sorts of events can also lead to the escalation of situations, which you see in a case like Walter Scott, who was shot after being stopped for a broken taillight. So the cost can go on and on. It also takes a toll on officers. When you speak to them, most officers didn't get into the profession to go and make really low-level stops and feel like they're targeting certain communities. They got in it because they wanted to serve the public. But there's a pressure to start conducting these sorts of activities because performance is measured this way and promotions hinge on that. So that really affects morale, which can affect the department morale and the department's actual relationships with the community as well.
So to put some kind of numbers and national context on that, I don't know if you want to kind of put that in.
Sure. So first of all, we'll say that this data is from 2011. So as a first comment, we don't have enough good data, and we should have better data. So that's one thing that, as kind of like working in this space, we should be pursuing. But in 2011, the national data showed that there were 21 million stops. Of those, 12% of the folks that were stopped believed that the police had acted improperly in stopping them. And so while 12% might not necessarily sound like a large number, it is when you have 21 million stops, because that's 2.5 million people that had a negative interaction with law enforcement. Furthermore, 3.5% of the folks that were stopped are then searched, and of those, 39% feel that police acted improperly. So this kind of captures the general sentiment about these sorts of law enforcement-civilian interactions.
So what we basically have here is a strategy and a hope to get certain benefits. The chief you'd mentioned kind of deterring crime and recovering guns. I think in many conversations with the department, I've also heard an emphasis on traffic safety as well. These are, after all, traffic stops. And, one question is, how do you figure out whether you're actually getting them? And Mark, if you could kind of talk a little about that.
Sure.
You might want to be closer.
Is that better?
Maybe even closer than that.
Even closer? Maybe it's not on.
Do you want to
It's
use
on?
this one?
You hear me? Okay. Okay. Well, I want to start with this question about what effectiveness is, because what are the benefits? I mean, as Chief Hagar suggested, there were 3 potential benefits that the city was looking at. One was crime reduction, 2 was traffic safety, 3 was actually positive community engagement. So it's interesting to hear both sides when in fact there may be maybe just the opposite. The other point I want to make in response to that is listening to Jim Bierman this morning, and I apologize for giving you a hard time. I think you said something like, well, effectiveness and benefit costs are synonymous. And I think, maybe you didn't say it that way, but that was the takeaway I got, and I said, no, that's wrong, they're not synonymous. And I think that's one of the points I want to make, and that is that when you start to think about what effectiveness is, and you asked me sort of how we measure these, and I'll mention this in a second, but we do have to be careful that even if it's very effective at what the goal is, it may not be a good idea, right? And I think that's the important point that I wanted to push back on, not that you would disagree with that. But I want to make that point very, very clearly, because it may be, as Linda suggested, that there's other reasons why, in fact, there are high costs associated with some of the things that are, quote, effective. But the first question is there effectiveness, right? Do traffic stops actually reduce crime? Do they actually improve traffic safety? And third one, which isn't on there, but which is important from Nashville's perspective, is do they actually help or hurt from the community engagement and view perspective? So those are 3 important questions. Now, how do you determine if it's effective? Well, I mean, we sort of all know about the gold standard. I think it was mentioned this morning in Washington. You know, you'll have the randomized controlled trial where you actually do these kind of very, very carefully designed studies. They're very expensive. They're hard to do, but you can do them. And they were done years ago in Minnesota on hot spots. And there have been a couple on traffic stops, actually. One that I know of anyway, one in Australia, one in Turkey recently. I don't know, maybe there are some in the US I don't know about, but they haven't found anything particularly exciting in terms of, but they haven't looked at crime reduction. Most of them are looking at police legitimacy. Most of them are asking the question, they're doing surveys of the public on legitimacy. And so that's sort of what the question that has been. You can certainly use statistical methods. I mean, looking at Nashville crime data, and that's what Sharon's going to be doing. You know, looking at the data to see what is actually collected. You know, how many offenses are found, and then in theory you can look at crime rates over time, across space, using multiple regression analysis. Very hard to do, but also very difficult to infer the causation because you expect that those police stops are going to be made in high crime areas. And so the question is, even if you found a decrease in crime, is it because of the police stop or is it because of the police presence? They're right there. I mean, is it the stop? So if they were there without stopping, would they have the same impact? Those are hard things to sort out. You can look for quasi-experiments, and statisticians and economists are good at looking for those kinds of unique things, like what happens if a police car breaks down and there's fewer police stops. It's random as opposed to intentional. Can you use that to help identify these impacts? Those are hard things to do, but in theory, that's what you can do with data.
Say a word more. Why does the randomness matter for those of us who are not social scientists? Why,
yeah. I mean, you know, the simple example is that if a police precinct captain says, you know, there's a lot of crime going on in this area, why don't you guys focus in that area? And they put their police cars out, they drive through that area, and they're routinely stopping. So we see a higher level of stops. If there's a deterrent effect, is it because of the stops? Or is it because the police presence is there, because they've got police cars there? And so it's hard to, you know, and so it's not a random, it's not like randomly we're just going to say, oh, let's see what happens when we have a police stop versus let's see what happens when we drive by. And so these are intentional. And again, one of the things that I know, I did an interesting police drive-through evening one day in Nashville. But one of the things that you learn when you talk to the police officers is, and you see it with the data, is some police officers like to do these stops, and some police officers don't like to do these stops. And there's differences across. Now, is that intentional? Is that random? Anyway, so that becomes a statistical issue for researchers to look at.
So let's say you can't figure out whether it works because you just don't have this way to tease it out. You know, one of the questions is whether you stop there, and I mean, Sharad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can comment on that. At first, I just want to comment on a couple of things that have been said. To Linda's point about the use of data and the fact that we have a relative dearth of data right now, I think that's super important. And one thing that we're doing in that direction is the Open Policing Project. So far, we are collecting data from all 50 states. We've released about 120 million traffic stop records. It's all publicly available, clean for people to play with, to parse. And we're also doing the same thing at the city level. So we're going to release about another 50 million stop records from 50 states across the country. And hopefully this is one first step towards this idea of just understanding what is the nature of policing. So I want to just put that out there in case people are interested. And then to Mark's point, I think this is exactly right, that it's extremely hard to quantify the effects of policing because we don't have this type of randomness. And so I'll give you one example of where we can do this, or at least we have a little bit of anecdotal evidence because we have this natural experiment. The so-called natural experiment is in New York. So here's shifting from traffic stops to pedestrian stops. So back in 2011, 2012, there were about 500,000 stops and frisks in the city. So that's a huge number of pedestrian interactions. Now it's, I think, about 10,000 per year. And so this is about 2% of what it was. And we haven't seen any increase in crime. And so this is a dramatic fall. It's not exogenous. It's not, you know, purely random that we've had this dramatic fall, but it happened quite quickly over the course of a couple of years, and we didn't see any kind of rise in crime. Actually, we saw a fall in crime. And so that is at least some evidence that this tactic was not directly impacting crime rates. And so when we have these types of scenarios, and again, we're sort of lucky when we see that, then we can say something about the effectiveness of these types of police tactics. But that's the exception, not the rule, and usually we're in these much harder cases where it's hard to infer what's going on.
Well, and to just put a point on it, I mean, part of why it's not fully exogenous, but almost exogenous, is that the stops plummeted as a result of the lawsuit. So it wasn't that, you know, the department saw that crime's down, so we can kind of relax. It was rather it was something that changed out in the legal world, and so it is kind of something that's at least a little more external.
Yeah, and also, in my view, the drop is so extreme that it is correlated with events. I mean, it's not random that there's a lawsuit at that point. We were at a high of, I think, 700,000 stops a year, and that's really 700,000 stops a year in 2011. And so this is not coincidental that sort of public sentiment was rising to the point where we had to do something about this. But still, when we're talking about a 2%, you know, 98% reduction in stops with no concurrent rise in crime, that tells you something. So that's the one situation where we can say something about quantitatively about what the effectiveness is of these types of policies. Another is where we can't necessarily, let me see if there's a slide up here, is that we were looking deeper into stop and frisk. I was like, okay, well, we don't know exactly what the cost is of a stop. We've already talked about all of these hard to measure components like community trust, and we don't exactly know what the benefits of a stop are in terms of, you know, what is it going to do on crime in the short term and all these other types of things. But what we did realize is that there are a relatively small number of stops that result in a lot of the intermediate benefits of, so for example, recovering weapons. And to put some numbers on this, we found that about 50% of the weapons that could be recovered from stop and frisk, you could do by carrying out 5% of the stops. So you still might not want to make any of these stops. I mean, we still don't actually know what the numbers are if you believe that there's actually not crime reduction benefit, then maybe you shouldn't do any of these. But to the extent that you believe that that you should be making these stops, well, you can get a lot of the intermediate benefit of weapons recovery by making a very, very small number of stops, 5% in this case. And how do we identify these stops? Well, we took this extremely simple strategy. We just went through all the records, and New York is good in the sense of providing all this detailed information that lets us do this type of analysis. We went through all the records, and we tried to identify patterns that one could use to identify stops that are likely to be successful in terms of this intermediate outcome of recovering weapons. So, for example, if an officer marks something like, you know, if a stop is predicated on, for example, a furtive movement, that we find is less likely to be successful than if a stop is predicated on something like sights and sounds of criminal activity. These are terms that the officers use in New York. And so again, this is maybe not, it's not particularly surprising, but when we look at the data and we actually do this type of analysis, we can find that finding these patterns that make a lot of sense after the fact can be used to dramatically improve our policy. So that's similar to the style of analysis we're taking in Nashville as well.
So say a word more about, if somebody were to actually try to implement what you guys found, what would that policy or practice actually look like?
Yeah, so there are a lot of ways to implement this. I mean, one is just intuitively realizing that there are a small number of stops that are really leading to most of the benefit. And so once one realizes this, then officers, I think, can prioritize stops in their own mind. And we actually see this when there was this dramatic fall in stops in New York City, that the success rate of these stops went up. And so when this was scaled back, officers weren't just scaling back randomly. Let's say, let's do 10,000 randomly of these 500,000, 600,000 stops we're doing. Let's actually prioritize it. So I do think that trained officers can, even without much instruction, if you say, well, do the relatively small number of stops that you really think are going to lead to something, I think they have some intuitive sense of how to carry out these things. Now, we went one step further, and we developed these heuristics and said, well, these are the types of stops that we think are most likely to lead to success. So stops where that are predicated, for example, like I said before, on sights and sounds of criminal activity, or a suspicious object, or what's called suspicious bulge. Again, these are terms that are used on these stop forms. And so we can say, well, these are the things that you really should be looking at. And there's, right now, officers have about 20 different factors that they're looking at on these forms. Say, okay, all these 20, you should keep these in your mind, but there are really a handful that statistically are most likely to lead to success. And so creating these heuristics and prioritizing these types of stops, one can, again, get the vast majority of the benefit, to the extent that there are benefits to these stops, while reducing significantly the costs. Now, one thing I also want to say is that the costs are reduced both in terms of just the interactions and in terms of the time that officers have to spend, but also in terms of racial disparities. And so in New York in particular, we're finding that a lot of these stops that were least likely to be successful disproportionately involved minorities. And so even though we were, our immediate interest was the effectiveness of these stops, we found that there was this double benefit, that not only were the stops more effective, they were less racially skewed. And so this is something a pattern that we find in many other places, that just making stops more effective, when there is this disproportionality in race, often that is mitigated. It often doesn't go away, but it's often mitigated by focusing on the stops that are most likely to be successful.
So Shar described, one way to try to narrow the footprint of policing, particularly in the absence of kind of concrete information about what we're doing, is working. Chief, I know we've kind of discussed this a lot, but even before the department brought us in, the MMPD has started to kind of think about how the department can be more strategic and focused. And I'd love if you can just say a little bit about the sorts of things that you've been trying in that regard.
So one of the things that we've had for several years, at each precinct, there's a dedicated sergeant that's called a community coordinating sergeant, whose sole purpose is to help develop and build and maintain those community relationships. Taking that from the larger scale and building and maintaining those relationships on a precinct-wide level and translating that to the street, to what those officers in the zones and the districts can actually do to help build those in the community. And for the past 2 years, we've been a partner with PSP, the Public Safety Partnership, and one of the things that the scientists there have helped us refine some of those efforts into is engaging in collective efficacy in some of our high crime areas. There's an area in Nashville that's pretty much widely known in Nashville as 40th and Clifton. It has been a high crime area for the duration of my tenure at the police department. The outreach efforts by those community coordinating sergeants, patrol officers, walking patrol, whatever we tried in that area was not working. And frankly, a lot of officers in the day would not want to respond to calls for service there until a backup car was available. Through collective efficacy and dedicating a group of officers, basically a flex team, a sergeant and 6 officers, to engage those community members in that specific area, reduce the calls for service volume that those officers are responsible for to answering calls only in that area. Allow those officers to spend more time with those citizens, identifying legitimate concerns that those citizens had with policing in their neighborhoods, legitimate concerns with crime, people who were coming to that area to engage in crime who did not live there. So building those relationships, helping those officers find those skills, enhance those skills to work within that limited area, both in calls for service and those proactive community efforts, is showing great promise. That program has been in place specifically for that area since January. In that area since January, we've seen a 23% reduction in crime. So those efforts to specifically engage in collective efficacy and community engagement are working. And we hope to expand that to other areas, other precincts.
Terrific. Bob, I should say, is working with the department on that and has been spearheading a lot of that effort. And we're hoping to find ways to collaborate as well. Mark, we've talked a lot about kind of benefits and how we might measure whether we're getting them, but given that this is cost-benefit analysis and ultimately the goal is to try to put things in a ledger, at least put them in some sort of proportional terms. I'd love if you can talk a little about whether there's ways to actually start to put value on some of the benefits of these strategies to the extent that we're seeing them, whether it's crime reduction or gun recovery and the rest.
Sure. So, look, the simple answer is that, sure, economists can put values on anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that lay people will appreciate or understand or agree that it makes sense to do it. But implicitly, we always put values when we make decisions. And so, when there's a government program that costs money, when you make a decision to employ police in this area or add police, and there's a crime reduction, you're implicitly saying we're willing to pay that amount for that crime reduction. And so economists have come up with various methods to do that. What you've asked me that really is to focus on the crime reduction for a second, and I guess we'll come back later if there's time to talk about some of the more interesting costs, which is the benefit of or at least the cost of the targeted enforcement, et cetera. But there are various ways to do that, and the main thing to realize is that the tangible costs are the, quote, easier ones. You can figure out what the cost to a victim is for medical costs or wage losses. You can figure out the cost of having to go through the criminal justice system, et cetera. Those are hard enough, but they're things that you can do. But the intangible cost, the cost, let's say, to a victim of crime, the pain and suffering, lost quality of life, those things are very, very important, and in fact, they dominate the cost once you start to value them. There are various methods you can use. I've looked in the past, we've looked at jury awards, for example, for intangible losses, what a pain and suffering award would be to either an accident victim or a crime victim who oftentimes can sue a third party. So that's one way of getting at intangible losses. Another is to do the contingent valuation that I think was mentioned this morning, the survey approach. And economists have done this with environmental harms, safety harms, and et cetera. And with well-designed, sophisticated analyses, surveying the public to figure out what they would be willing to pay ex ante to reduce the risk of certain harms. And that's a good measure of the social value of reducing those harms. So those sorts of survey methods have been used. I think you put up some numbers from a study I'd done a while back, but you can get an idea of the value that can be used in a benefit cost analysis per crime. If you were to look at the out-of-pocket costs associated with a rape, for example, it's maybe a few $1,000s, a few $100s. But if you look at the estimated value, and this is not the cost to an individual, but this is how much I would have estimated society would be willing to pay to reduce one statistical rape. So that's not the cost to a rape victim directly, but it's the value, if you will, of what society believes in these kinds of surveys. We ought to be paying to reduce each rape. Again, those are statistical values. So that's the kind of work that can be done.
And one of the things that motivated our work around cost-benefit analysis was, we saw a lot of the work that Mark and others had been doing to try to assess the cost of crime, and the one thing that was often missing from these studies and others is any talk of the costs of then policing. So part of what we've tried to do, and where I'd love to pivot us for the last bit of this panel, is to really think about whether these same strategies could be used in thinking about the costs, not only or the benefits of policing, but also its costs. So Linda, you talked in kind of pretty general terms about the variety of concerns, and I'm wondering if you could kind of articulate them more. If we were to try to think about what's the cost of a stop or the cost of many stops within a community, what might some of those costs be?
Sure. I mean, you can start, do we have that? Great. Time. This is folks' time in any time that they're being stopped, and that would be pretty easily quantifiable. You have to look at the anxiety. What is the price of trauma, and how do you measure that when it is especially pervasive in communities of color where they're just heavily policed and experiencing high volumes of these stops? We've touched upon the racial harm because there are disparities. among, in these communities as well as with any other, throughout the criminal justice system, but especially, as Sherrod was noting, in the stop context, as we saw in New York City. The community trust piece is, that, again, you can survey that, right? And there have been surveys done, but it's difficult, again, to quantify, and we really need better, better approaches in trying to do that. There just is a tremendous amount of distrust when you talk to these communities that have been subject to these practices for a very long time. And I think the price that law enforcement is paying is really just like looking bad and not having good relationships with these communities, especially when oftentimes you need those folks on your side. You need them to cooperate when you're actually dealing with more serious crimes and trying to figure those things out. The intrusiveness, again, is similar to the anxiety trauma piece. How do you measure the feeling that you're not free from this government intrusion? And, and there might even be other things that we could look at that might be more quantifiable. For example, heavily policed places where you're seeing a lot of these stops, what are the property value issues there, and things of that nature. These are all important things that I think we need to look at in terms of figuring out the cost side of it.
For sure, and as Linda mentioned, some of the costs are maybe more quantifiable than we'd like to think, and something we did as a quick exercise, this is using Nashville's numbers, was try to think about the time costs just to the people stopped, so the driver and any passengers in their vehicle, and this is a methodology that's used throughout government in trying to value highway construction projects. So anytime we build a highway, usually it's to try to save people time, and we want to try to put a value on that to try to figure out whether it's worth expanding, the 3-lane highway to the 4 or the 5. And the way that economists have done that is to think about, how much time are you saving, or in this case, how much time are people being detained, and the average, just using Nashville data, is about 10 minutes for a stop, which feels pretty intuitive. They estimate, how many people are in a car, and there's pretty well established methodologies for figuring out how many people are going to be on the road. And then you try to think about what the value is that people would put on their time. And what economists have tended to do is, peg it to wages, but reduce it a little under the kind of economist theory that people value their leisure a little bit less than their wages, because otherwise they would spend more time on leisure than on work. And we could spend forever debating whether that makes sense or not, but that tends to be how it's done. And what you can do very easily, I did this in all of 5 minutes, very back of the envelope, is you multiply all of those numbers and divide them, and what you find is just the time costs to the people stopped are about $1.1 million a year in a department that makes 250,000 stops. Now, whether that's a big number or a little number really depends on what you're getting for it, but at least you're starting to get some numbers and some tangibility. And so that's kind of one way to start to think about, what are other things that we can start to put these sorts of values on. But lastly, that's the kind of easiest to quantify in some way, and in some ways the hardest, but most important in this context are the racial harms and the racial disparities that people have come back to. And so, Mark, I guess before talking about how we might try to get at those, I'm curious if you can even just articulate, what are the different sorts of harms or costs that, would fall under that broader umbrella?
Well, first of all, I think you've got a lot of them here. The one thing, and this is also listening to Linda, it's sort of implied here. I don't know if anybody happened to see CNN last night. There was a Wisconsin Assemblywoman on Chris Cuomo. It was the most powerful interview I've seen in a long time. And she was a Wisconsin Assemblywoman campaigning, African-American woman, and somebody called the police. Thought she was a drug dealer. And her daughter was in the car, and her mother was on the street, on and on and on. Well, it was the most, But what struck me was what I've heard, and to hear it so directly, was the humiliation and indignity. Okay, and that's not kind of captured there, but not entirely. So I think there is that side of it that, you know, as a white male, it's hard to understand, but I can understand it. I mean, I try, but you know, you get it when you see something like that. And that part of it's really, I think, even more subtle than what's up there, but it's there. And so coming to your question about well, how does one, you know, can economists help in this regard? So first of all, I want to say that when you look at what Sharad was showing us in New York, there's a win-win, right? It's almost it's almost like, okay, we can get the same benefit with fewer stops. Everyone agrees. If we go back to what Barry put up this morning, you know, got all these potential costs associated with these. Okay, easy. That's an easy one, right? But then the question is, what about the rest of the stops, okay? And how do we start to judge whether or not those are, once you're beyond the win-wins, whether those are worthwhile doing or not? And that's really what the realm we're in right now. And I do think, I mean, these are not the only ways to do it, but I think they do help inform policymakers when you can do a good benefit cost analysis. So, I mean, we've mentioned the contingent valuation surveys, the kind of surveys. I mean, but if you step back for a second, think about an individual think about a minority in a minority community thinking about police stops. Well, if they're stopped, immediately there's fear, there's risk. From their perspective, there's risk that something bad will happen, even if they aren't an offender, right? So there's fear associated with that. Then you start to step back. What about the members of the minority group who, in fact, are not stopped? Well, they have a risk and a fear that they will be stopped. And what happens? Well, there's avoidance behaviors. They may drive differently in different parts of the city. They may do things differently. There's lots of anecdotal evidence about that. And so then you start back. Well, what about the public at large? People like me. Well, you know, I want to live in a non-discriminatory society, and I also want police legitimacy. I want their, you know, so I would value a society in which, in fact, you didn't have those kinds of issues. So I think, you know, and a well-designed survey could start to do that, and you start to look at trade-offs. So what you do is you say to people, here's 2 or 3 options. Which one would you choose? Well, one may have more police stops. One may have fewer police stops. One would have higher crime rates. One would have lower crime rates. One would have another policy, perhaps, so you can vary policies. And in a sophisticated analysis, you don't ask them how much would you pay. You ask them which would you prefer, this one or that one or the status quo. And from that, you then infer the valuation and what the actual, in this case, negative valuation of a police stop is, holding out, you know, crime rates, et cetera, holding them. So that's the kind of analysis that could be done to get at some of these. They're not easy, but it's possible to do.
And that kind of work, as Mark and others know, has been done throughout, you know, environmental regulation and public health, and to start to put values on these sorts of intangibles. And a lot of what we'd like to do is to try to do those around criminal justice. Now, I see Barry waving at me as subtly as he thinks he is, and I think we're out of time, but I wonder if I can beg like 2 questions, or should we? Yeah. Alex?
Do we have a mic, or should I just? Alex Vitale from Brooklyn College. So, you know, Charles Epps's work shows that, you know, traffic stops should be understood in 2 ways. One where there's a clear traffic violation, and the others that are pretextual. And that it's the pretextual stops that generate so much of the feelings about racial disproportionality, invasion of privacy. And the majority of these stops are drug interdiction stops. And they have very low hit rates. And I would say, even more importantly, even when there is a hit, there's an assumption that that's a success and that that's a benefit, when in fact there's absolutely no evidence of any kind that those successful drug interdiction stops produce any public safety or any public health benefit, that they interfere with anyone's availability to get drugs for even 10 seconds.
I take that as a comment, not a question, and so.
I don't think you're going to get a lot of disagreement.
We agree.
Maybe I'll even comment on one aspect of it, is that even when we think about the traffic stops, like the real traffic safety stops, it's still not clear. Like even these 2 classes, it's not clear. And presumably the theory is if you pull people over for speeding, you're reducing, you know, harms from accidents, which is quite plausible, and I'm sure it happens to some effect. But what is that trade-off? And so I do think we need to think about even both of these classes.
And if I agree, and can I make one quick comment, and that is that it's really difficult. I mean, I try to put myself in a police officers and a police captains or chiefs hat sometimes. It's hard because, in fact, they're not charged with maximizing social welfare. They're charged with enforcing the law. And so even though an economist like me would agree with you, first of all, we shouldn't be going after these drug offenses, and even if we did, where there's no crime benefit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's not their job. Their job is to enforce the law. And that's always a really difficult thing in this area. And I think at the highest levels, police chiefs are much more sophisticated and are doing their best to try to figure out how do I get something other than just purely, because we all know there's discretion. But you hit on a very important point that I don't think has really been addressed here as well.
And I just want to add one thing. With regard to the legitimate traffic stops, we also have to think about the concerns about the fines and fees that are associated with that. When you are making traffic stops in high crime areas, quote unquote, those tend to be communities of color, and so it's disproportionately affecting those folks, and we saw that in places like Ferguson.
So Maria, I just want to make a point, and I don't want to throw a monkey wrench into the works, but I think the lens is all wrong. We keep on looking at crime reduction as the primary outcome. And in my view, it's about how do you empower communities? How do you really put some sustainability with respect to how the police engage and support communities going forward? One of the things that was particularly important, particularly in the two neighborhoods we were working in Nashville, was the notion of social cohesion. And going into communities that have been plagued with crimes for generations and decades. And the question is saying, well, how can this go on for so long? And the notion was that neighbors that couldn't trust neighbors, didn't know what their environment was like, felt no power, felt marginalized and disenfranchised. The difference that was being made in Nashville is the officers went in, and it's not just making relationships, it was really starting to get neighbors to work with one another, understanding from their perspective what the problems were, and developing strategies that were supportive of them, at the same time getting at the root cause. So the crime reduction was a side benefit or byproduct, not the directive in terms of how these officers engage in those neighborhoods.
I can't think of a better note on which to end, and so we will. I think we're doing a very quick turnaround to the third panel, so if folks can largely stay put, we'd be grateful, and I think Anne is taking over from here.
So we're going to get started in a second. I'm hoping that Samson Yangwe walks back in. I saw him just a little bit ago. I have both an introduction and an announcement. So some of you, but not everyone, I know, and I apologize for that, are joining us after this for lunch and some more conversation. If you're doing that, there'll be folks who will show you how to get over to Furman Hall, which is just out the door to the right, and then a quick left. So that's where I would direct you all. I'm going to turn this over to Anne Milgram.
Hi.
I can't do that without saying that Anne has been vital to the birth and success of the policing project in very many ways, and with her own many endeavors has refused any formal title with us, and so we've bestowed one on her, which is patron saint, and we thank you.
I prefer spirit animal.
Spirit animal is good too. So I'm going to give Ed his mic back and let you get started.
Great. Gary, is Sam coming? Okay. So thank you so much. This is very exciting and just a terrific topic. And I've had a chance to, I know most of the panelists and look at their bios. And what I'm going to try to do today is just stir it up a little bit after this morning. I will tell you that my view is 4 people as a panel, 8 people as a party. So, you know, we're going to try to have an interesting conversation. And I'm going to start with my friend, Jim Bierman, who runs the Police Foundation, is a former chief. And Jim, I'm just going to ask you, I want your reaction to sort of what you've heard in the last 2 panels. And I don't want you to say the good stuff, because I think, and it's not that there isn't a lot of good stuff we've talked about, but I want to hear, you know, you're so deep in the policing world, give me your high-level reaction, and then talk through a little bit of if you were to go out and give this speech to a room full of police officers, what are the challenges there?
Yeah, so I personally like to think about these things as if somebody was dumb enough to make me a police chief again, how would I think differently about the job? Because I've had some time and distance now between doing that job where you really feel like you're a firefighter all the time as opposed to a police chief. You know, you struggle all the time trying to find time to think about things. But I encourage us to think a lot about policing culture. We've bumped up against it a couple of times, and I think Chris Magnus made a comment about that. But I don't think we spend enough time thinking about the culture of policing and how we end up in this place where the behavior of police officers is such that we don't like it, whether we're talking about traffic stops for pretextual reasons or bad behavior. So, and I want to be really clear, I am not talking about abusive, bad policing, okay? That's not the piece I'm talking about. There are people in the business that have no business carrying a badge, and I think good cops don't want them in there any more than anybody else does. I'm talking about these, how do we get to a place where good, compassionate people who are willing to become cops do things every day because that's how they think they're protecting the community, that are perceived and consumed entirely different. There's a diametric opposition to how cops think about traffic stops and how the community might think about traffic stops, right? So I was showing somebody off the previous panel this idea of connecting crime reduction and traffic stops, right? I don't disagree with anything I think I heard on the panel before, but when you look at this from a policing perspective, there's a program called DDAX that is taught by the federal government under the previous administration. It's probably still taught. It's funded by NHTSA and other parts of DOJ are part of there, that clearly links traffic enforcement with crime reduction. I was just looking at the publication that came out a couple of years ago on this thing. And that's what's being taught to police officers, so they hit the street thinking that I'm making my community safer by stopping people for, whatever. Now, traffic cops.
Can I bring Ron in on this now?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
Ron, our friend at the end of the panel, was the head of the cops office. He's a former police chief. One of my favorite things that I heard Ron say on a panel once is that we talked about Zumba. Do you remember this in the community? That I know it seems strange in the context of policing, but Ron was talking about, like, how do you build relationships with the community, and if you have to, you do Zumba. You could probably explain that better than I'm telling that story. But first tell us about Zumba, and then tell us about, what Jim is saying, right? And my experience with the Camden Police Department, which I love dearly, is that, Jim's right. We teach officers to go out and do something. We give them a mission, and then they go out and do it. And your line officers are not thinking about CBA, as they're walking the streets. And the bosses, when I would talk to them, all they wanted was another officer, right? Like the financial conversations I had were, can I hire 3 more people? So you come in as our policing and our policy expert.
So, well, good morning, everyone. I think a couple of things that come up what Jim was alluding to, this whole idea of cost-benefit analysis. I think the component that's missing from a business point of view would be, what is the return on the investment? And what I mean by that is we're pretty good at trying to measure the cost-benefit. But until we define the role of a police in a democratic society, we're going to have a different return on the investment. If I consider the last panel said that the job was to enforce the law, says who? Who decided that? Where does it say, when I raised my hand in the Constitution, I don't remember anything saying about I promise to reduce crime by 5%. I raised my hand to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So who defines the job of the police? And if it's defined as being crime reduction, then the return on my investment for car stops is suppression. It is returning, getting guns. It's all the things that we talked about. And unfortunately, that is still being taught. That NHTSA program has been around for about 10 years. They call the complete car stop, of how to take a car stop from beginning to end, from a pretext to a consensual search, the whole thing. And that is one of the hypocrisies, and quite often with the federal government, is we teach it in one part of the government, and then we investigate you for a pattern practice on the other end of the government, right? That was, if you think about Operation Pipeline, and drug interdiction programs was probably the best case back with the DEA. So we got some work to do inside. But we really have to define that. And what I've come to learn as a police chief is when we define the role of the police, more often we become co-producers of public safety. And what Anna's talking about with Zumba is the question that drove me as a police chief is, how do you reduce crime and do so without the collateral damage? How do you do no harm first? And it came to me realizing, just living in my neighborhood, that the best deterrent to crime is not a street full of cops. It's a street full of residents that are living, that are occupying their space, that are in control of their own destiny. The job of the police is to facilitate that And so there's no such thing as taking territory. So we put officers in the field when I was in East Palo Alto, and we used shot spotters as our benchmark, track all the gun activations. We put officers out there to walk in the parks, to take kids on bike rides, to do Zumba dancing in the afternoon, to walk with seniors and occupy spaces of neighborhoods that were just plagued by gun violence. And we saw 30–40% reductions in gunshots. I mean, tracked by the system, not by people calling, because people may misreport or sometimes don't report. And we saw these reductions without a single arrest and starting to engagement. And the more the neighbors got out, the more I think Bob Haas mentioned it, the more they got to know each other, the more they engaged, then the more they took ownership of their public spaces, their communities, and they pushed back. So I think where Jim was heading is 1,000% right, is we unfortunately are teaching that, and it causes the officers a lot of problems, because if you look at stop and frisk, you look at a lot of the programs, the rank and file officer didn't develop the program. They're the ones told to do it. And then when it goes bad, we say they need more training, right? Right? We tell them that if you don't make these stops, you can't advance in the organization. Your performance evaluations suffer. You can't go to vice or narcotics. You can't ride a motorcycle. But then when the stats come out and say, hey, it's the spirit towards African Americans, well, you need cultural sensitivity training. You need implicit bias training. You guys are bad. And it's actually people sitting here with my titles and others that are the chiefs, the mayors that promise these crime reductions, that are setting the agenda. So we have to start by defining, what do you want as a community member for the police to play in a democratic society? And once you do that, then when I do my cost-benefit analysis, I can identify what is the return on my investment. And I agree with the last person. Making a drug arrest may have no return on investment whatsoever. And 12% hit rates and 15% hit rates, if I was a private business, we'd be bankrupt.
So let's
And
go to
so-
private
right.
business, because this is a perfect transition. And by the way, you tell the Zumba story that I remember just a million times better than I can. Ralph, you run a company called ShotSpotter. My experience with ShotSpotter was there would be a very tragic event in a city, and people would call you and say, okay, how are we going to think about this going forward? So at least my experience in New Jersey was there's a crisis. People bring you in that moment. But what I really want to ask you is, when we think about the business case, I mean, you were sitting in a business where you were trying to help cities and police departments prevent gun violence. How do you think about cost-benefit analysis? And the second piece is, how much does the money piece of this actually, like when you're walking into a city, is it this reaction to a crisis? Is it the CBA piece, the cost-benefit? Like, what sells your product when you walk in?
There's a lot of questions there.
I know,
so
the
good
objection
morning,
compound
everyone.
question.
So the way I think about the work that we do is really first and foremost around providing a solution to help police departments address a huge public safety gap. Sadly, and this has been documented, I think, by the Brookings Institute, 80 to 90% of gunfire events go unreported. So that means effectively guns are being fired, police are not showing up because they're not being called, and that sets up a pattern of normalization of gun violence that we're all complicit in accepting. And that, to me, is not moral. It's not right. Because what I know is that when a gun's fired in a nice neighborhood, there's no question about response whatsoever. And we have this notion that if gunfire happens at this part of the neighborhood involving these types of victims and these type of perpetrators at 2 a.m. in the morning, we care less about it. And so at the end of the day, our system is really designed, if used properly, is to help police departments be much more responsive in a very precise, fast way to these incidents of gun violence, and really serving that community in a way that wouldn't be possible without our solution. So before we talk about any notion of reductions in gunfire, reductions in homicides and the like, to me it's much more of a binary question. Are you fundamentally doing your job to serve and protect the community and not showing up to 80 to 90% of the gunfire? That's just unacceptable to me. And I have a personal notion about this, living in Oakland, California, being born and raised in Oakland, California, and I know there's a tale of two cities in my community where there's a community where I grew up, where gunfire is accepted. There's a community I happen to live in now where it is completely not acceptable. And that's the thing that we try to address. Now, beyond that, when you get to more of the tactical benefit of our solution, again, hopefully, and it really all revolves around, how an agency is going to use the technology in the right way. We hope, we expect, we train our agencies to be much more, I would say, intentional around investigating all incidents of gun crime. And the reason this is important, if I could just
Yep.
just finish on this, is that, it's understood, I think, and been very well researched that it's very few individuals that drive most of the gun crime. So the extent that you can be very robust and intentional around investigating today's gunfire incident, which could be tomorrow's
When you walk-
homicide or
Yep.
GSW, that's important.
Yeah, when you walk into a police department, what do they care the most about? And I don't need your internal trade secrets, but the chief sits across from you. Is he saying, like, are you saying to him, look, I know I can save you lives and money? Like, what role does the sort of cost benefit play in those conversations?
I mean, so police departments and executives in police departments are just like any other folks. I mean, I think the first thing that they're worried about, whether they state it or not, is how is this going to make me look personally? And so that sets up a kind of interesting conversation because you have more forward-leaning chiefs, I would say, that would understand their duty to serve and protect and take that very seriously and aren't kind of worried about I think the downstream consequences of having data out there that they can't control or manipulate, and they have a strategy to serve and protect that way. And I would say there's more, conservative police executives that say, hey, look, this narrative of, like, right now I don't have a problem. If gunfire happens here involving these people at this time of the morning, why would I want to introduce this concept of all these other incidents of gunfire that now people are going to expect me to have some answer to that in terms of reductions in gun violence, reductions in homicides? And we all know that this is such an incredibly complicated situation that ShotSpotter by itself cannot be singularly responsible for reductions in gunfire
course,
and
yeah.
violence and all that stuff. It's really more of a comprehensive approach.
Great. So I want to turn to Liz. Liz, I want to give you an opportunity if there's stuff on the panel you want to respond to. I also want you to, Liz oversees criminal justice for the city of New York. And so she's not just policing, she's also courts and jails and prosecutors. And so, this is a really narrow conversation we're having today about police and cost benefit. Let's think about, what's your reaction to that part of it?
Yeah, so luckily, my reaction to the panel and your question intersect, because in fact, it sort of is an ecosystem. And I wanted to pick up a little bit on one of the things that Ron said, which is, what is it that we're actually trying to do here? And what is the role of police and more than police? Is it that we're trying to reduce crime? And that implies sort of the hot center of law enforcement, prosecutors, DAs, police, courts, what we traditionally think about as the criminal justice system. Or is what we're trying to do to create safety, which is a little bit different, and police surely play a role in that, but also very much to Ron's point, so does I'm a New Yorker, so does every New Yorker, every resident of the jurisdiction, and multiple others. And creating safety is about more than simply, I think, the absence of crime. It's about having opportunities for jobs and places to play and all those other things that become the organic way that that crime itself is reduced. And I think about it specifically in the cost-benefit world and in sort of the particular place that New York is right now. So New York, of course, no panel is complete in New York City without a shout out to exceptionalism. And so I won't disappoint. But New York is unusual in the durability and steepness of its reductions in both crime and incarceration. And so we're in a very unusual time right now. Arrests are down almost 30%, stop and frisks are down north of 95%, summonses are down 60 or 70%, just the foot is off the gas of enforcement. And one thing that I think we're starting to see tendrils of is that as enforcement, kind of the coercion of obeying rules recedes a bit, the role of neighborhoods, New Yorkers themselves, of sort of more organic networks of families, neighborhood, previous panel talked a lot about social cohesion, I think begins to surge, and we see this in sort of very concrete ways. We have a very, very big network of violence interrupters who also have jobs programs associated with them and mental health programs. We've developed something called MAP, which is essentially neighborhood CompStat for neighborhoods, where instead of looking at the 7 majors, we look at sort of civilian markers of well-being in a neighborhood, hand in hand with people who live there.
And what about
And so just to the, sorry, I didn't mean to suck all the oxygen out of the room, but just the last thing is just so to the cost-benefit point, to me, the interesting cost-benefit thing would be, what is the cost or cost avoidance of safety in using police or maybe using some of these more durable and organic networks, i.e. family, neighborhood, et cetera, which are there all the time.
So Liz, when you think about whether it's, you know, it's bail reform, it's diversion from the system, what role does this sort of cost-benefit piece, like, does it play any
Yeah.
role? How does it figure?
So I think it's actually huge, and I think the other thing, so first I think, you know, we should never think about the police, and I don't think they think themselves in this way, as an island. And so their actions affect every part of the system from a cost and well-being point of view. You know, what's the yield from arrests to jail? What's the yield of summonses to courts? And to what degree is issuing hundreds of thousands of summonses for drinking alcohol in public actually changing that behavior? Like, why are we doing that if people continue to pee in the street and, you know, drink beer, right? So I think it's really, really important to see it as a kind of ecosystem. And I think there's a second reason, if I'm allowed to.
Yeah, please.
Which is, you know, into the laps of police drop every problem. That isn't actually their issue. It's just that they're the ones who called. We have a very muscular 911 muscle. You call 911, police arrive, and then the whole mechanics of the justice system come into play. But what do we do, and more, I think, us and other jurisdictions, and I know you've done a ton of work on this, you know, think about mental health. Well, it could be that somebody's wielding a machete in the middle of the street and there is a true public safety issue. It could be that he's off his meds and he's mumbling and somebody needs to do something else and we need a social worker. So another kind of cost-benefit thing of how do we actually make those choices, and are we sending fully loaded cop at $200,000, $250,000 a year, or are we sending mental health
Social worker, yeah. So I'm going to pivot just a little bit here to Dahlia and then to Ed, and I want to talk a little bit about media and politics, because I think what we've seen in the last 5 years, 10 years, maybe 5 years, is just a huge shift in the way we think about criminal justice and reform, and particularly policing, but a lot of different areas across our country. And I think the media has played a huge role in this. And, you know, I'm personally a believer in, you know, for a long time, people weren't actually telling the stories that I think the media is now telling. And there's a breakthrough conversation happening about race, inequality, fairness, public safety, that just in my entire time in criminal justice has not happened until recently. And so I want to turn it to Dahlia to really talk about what is the role of the media, and what do you know, what's your thought on the CBA stuff? Like,
So you know, it's interesting because when I was listening to the first panel this morning and I was kind of tracking the list of benefits that were laid out, transparency, accountability, trust, public understanding, better understanding of how policing happens. I mean, those are PR problems. Those are principally media problems. And, you know, I think it's fascinating that the press unerringly is going to be the conveyor of some of those benefits. And so there's a huge stake in doing that correctly. And, you know, I think that I totally agree, Anne, that the media has smoked out that which was unknown or not spoken These are watershed moments. Michael Brown is a media solution. But I think, my favorite constitutional quote of all time is actually the Homer Simpson quote about beer. There's a beer motif now unfurling itself on this end of the panel. But Homer Simpson famously says of beer, beer, it's the cause of and solution to all of our problems. And I think that can be said of the media as well. I think the media is actually the cause of and also the solution to an enormous amount of what you're describing.
Break that into, tell us why you're the cause and why you're the solution.
Well, I think we are the solution for some of the reasons that I've said. I think that but for deep dives that places like the Washington Post do and ProPublica do, and but for people with cell phones who are able to tell stories that the media was not interested in gathering 10 years ago, we would not know a lot of what we know. I think that it is a hugely problematic thing that the media is interested in one narrative, and it's what I call the umbrage cycle. So something appalling happens, the media rushes in, they tell usually a bad first draft that becomes the narrative, and then America picks sides, and you can decide whether you are on the side of the police or whether you are on the side of the victim, and that will reinforce itself over days and weeks, and that is not the way to talk about cost-benefit analysis. It is not the correct frame for the work I think we're trying to do here. And I think that umbrage cycle is actually, when it happens under the Klieg lights with all the emotion and all the justifiable fury on both sides, that is not a sober place from which to make policy or talk about policy. And so it just seems to me that a lot of these questions we're talking about today, including body cameras, including privacy, these are also fundamentally and foundationally media problems. And body cams, as someone said in the first panel, can either exculpate or they can implicate, or actually confusingly they can do a bit of both, which I think is what I tend to see. But those are questions about relationships with the press and how the press, I think, quite lazily often defaults into that cycle. And I think the only thing I want to do is also echo what Ron said, which is, at bottom, if this is a conversation in America that we need to be having about what we think police should do, it seems to be the best mechanism for initiating a smarter, newer conversation about that would be by asking the media to interrupt its umbrage reporting, to have that conversation, not in a way that is sort of rooted in polemical ideology, but is rooted in truth and fact. And I think that barring the press coming into that conversation in a meaningful way, we're kind of going to play this on a loop. And I think the coda to that point, I think, has to be that if our only concern, and we've heard it said a few times, is how do I look? How do I look in that moment on both sides, again, of this cycle of pain and recrimination? And that is the determinative question that is going to, I think, unerringly lead to really bad answers.
So this brings us to the exact point I wanted us to come to next, which is really a very deeper conversation about politics and about sort of how we think about this in America. And Ed, I'm coming to you for obvious reasons. You have experience in the political space. The thing I want to sort of present to you is that we're having an incredibly rational conversation about cost-benefit analysis, which I love, but I also, have run police departments, have run prosecutors' offices, and I gotta be honest that a lot of the conversations are not as rational as the wonderful people up here today are making it seem, right? And to me, the politics question is a huge question, particularly in America, where for so long the answer has always been, how much money would you spend to be safe? Any amount of money, right? And sort of like it's a quick political thing that I think we've always seen when you see candidates running for office. I'm tougher on crime than somebody else. It really is not about money in the public's eye a lot. And again, I think that's changing. But I really want to sort of ask you, when cost-benefit analysis and these rational, evidence-based things come right up against politics, what happens?
Well, first of all, we at the Center for American Progress are a 501c3, and so I just want to make that clear.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I was
no, just
talking
wanna-
about your
just
prior
need to
work.
put it out there,
I'm
but
sorry.
prior work.
Can you tell us your prior job?
My prior job. So I've been at the Justice Department. I was at the Justice Department for 11 years, both at the Civil Rights Division, where Ann was as a prosecutor, and then also as a policy person working with Ron and others, especially after Trayvon Martin, after Ferguson, and after the national attention to this really came about. I think that's a really good question, because I think it's not only about CBA, but it's just data in general, right? So data in general, in terms of how it affects policymakers, how it affects decision makers, has only really become popularized. I mean, obviously all the researchers in this room, practitioners have thought about it and used it for a while, but it's been popularized by politicians very recently. It hasn't been something that's been engaged. And so I think with that comes a lot of both positives and negatives. I'm going to piggyback on what you asked, Jim, at the beginning, which is kind of something that, maybe unspoken, that needs to be said, which is the limits of CBA generally, right? And I think in this respect, bringing the political lens to it, presentation matters. So I was struck by the last panel with Mark Cohen's graphic or list of values that were placed on the prevention of certain crimes, right? So murder homicide was a 6 figures. The society would pay 6 figures for preventing a murder or homicide, but something, a third of that for preventing a rape or sexual assault. I mean, presentation matters. And that's why when we're looking at CBA and we're trying to reduce things to numbers, the reductiveness of numbers affects politics and affects people, especially with the history that we have in this country of race. And we know from the history of race that people of color, black and brown people, have been reduced even further in terms of the value of their lives. And so when we see that, when you look at how CBA and you're saying this equates to your safety, this dollar figure equates to your safety, that's a really dangerous thing going forward. Having said that, there are ways I think that we can use dollar figures when it is presented in a way that is away from the value of human life, which is in a lot of ways public safety, but more about different aspects of how to run government and government efficiency. All of this comes into play together, but I just wanted to make that just a point about how far we go towards relying on numbers almost to exclusivity. And I'll end with this. And last year, we were putting on a conference, and I asked Nick Turner from the Vera Institute, to come and speak on the power of data and the power of evidence-based reforms and so forth. And in his 10 to 12 minute time slot, I think he spent maybe a minute on that. And then he spent the rest of the time talking about how to relate that to people and not to, again, reduce people to a data point or a dollar figure. And I think that...
So Ed, if you're sitting in a room and you're talking, you're interested in a bunch of different aspects of criminal justice reform, how do you sort of handle the politics to get folks to engage on some of the CBA questions, start having, this broader cost-benefit conversation?
Yeah, I think so. One, it depends on what the topic is, right? So I think when you look at, we've covered a couple types of things in this session of where technology and the cost of technology come in. One is when it is a crime or public safety, reducing crime, reducing offenses, and that's one bucket. And the other bucket, and I'm not saying these are exclusive to each other, is kind of the police accountability aspect of it and keeping government functions accountable. And there is that intersection where we're writ large calling it trust. But the way that you talk about CBA in a public safety sense versus a police accountability sense is different, except that I'm like contradicting myself as I speak. The one area where I can see the similarities is when we're going back to the original conversation about police culture. So if you're looking at numbers and presenting them in public safety terms, you have an audience that says, don't reduce me to that, and so forth. And then if you're looking at that in an accountability sense, you're hearing police officers saying, these are not, this is the numbers that are going to affect me and so forth. So I think the way that you present really matters. And then, we all know this. I'm Captain Obvious here. I'm going to do Hotels.com commercials. But we're like talking about making sure that people are in the room for that conversation. And it's not just data scientists, politicians, and so forth, but the people who are actually affected are in the room for those
So
conversations.
this leads us, and I wanted to actually come back to you, Ron, and Jim with sort of high-level question, and I'll invite you, Ron, to start so you can jump in on whatever you want to jump in on. But I do think in some ways there's a real conversation here about policing culture and how police departments make decisions and how they approach questions, particularly because, you think about, and Ed just said, who's in the room? Is it data scientists? I once had, technologists building an app for police officers. My officers all came in suits and uniforms, and my technologists came in T-shirts and shorts, no shoes. And it was like worlds apart. And it took us a day to get through just to get them on this, they both needed translation for day one, right? By day 5, we were fine. But I do think a little bit of, we have an economist come in, we have a data scientist come in. It's not the world we live in today in policing. And so there is a culture question, I think, writ large for you guys to think about. If you wanted to do this in a department you ran, how do you do it?
So I go back to the original question. The culture is really dictated more than people think by the demands of the community and by the elected officials. And what I mean by that is if my job is based on the ability to reduce crime, then the culture will be to respond and to prevent that crime. So for an example, if I'm going to be judged on how fast I can reduce crime, then I'm going to take the strategies and tactics. I don't have time for research. I don't want to hear a PhD talk about this has not been proven yet. All that is irrelevant. I need to respond. I need to suppress the crime. Otherwise, I'm out. If I basically have a culture where people understand that the police play a role, but not the only role, we work together, then the culture would be of cost-benefit analysis, research. But there's a part of it, too. The chief, and you know this from your position, can also provide cover for elected officials. If I'm the one saying, I want to take our time, I want to engage the community, I want to believe in reentry, I want to engage people that have been formerly incarcerated, I want to basically empower the community, give up my power to the community, that gives the mayor and the council basically cover to do that, because as crime will go up a little bit or will continue for a while, you don't have the chief saying, if you only gave me 20 more cops, I could reduce it. If you increase my budget 15%, I'll make you safer. We're now basically our partners in it. So the culture is determined not by policy. We have a phrase, culture eat policies for lunch every day, is determined primarily based on, in my opinion, the tone that is set even outside the department. What do you want from your police department? I always give the example with the medical field. If there's a pandemic or an epidemic in a nation, you look to the doctors to cure it and to find a solution to it. But no one demonstrates in front of the hospital and says, you do your job, doc. If there's a crime wave, you're standing in front of my PD saying, do something or you're fired. Which means that the only thing I have left now is I got a big ass hammer and everything looks like a nail, and I'm gonna bang that sucker in there until the crime goes down and I save my job. Yep. Now, unless I'm prepared to say, and when I think police chiefs that believe that, if you listen to the community, if you really engage them, they don't want that solution. You force them to believe that they're the only solution. You've taken all the resources for everything else, and if you were to give some of that up, the community understands, are more sophisticated than we give them credit for, and they will work with us. They will give us time, and they won't evaluate success on whether you got a 10% reduction in crime. And when we started this in the 90s, that nonsense of, this reduction every 2 days, and somehow that's the measurement of success versus relationships and changing the root conditions that cause crime. How do you talk about reducing crime when you still got a 45% dropout rate, unemployment rates, social disparities, inequities all across the board, and you think the solution to crime is me putting some cops out there making stops? That is giving people an excuse not to do their job. So I think that culture depends, if you set it and you make it clear to the elected officials, make it clear to the department what you want, that will start affecting the culture, because it allows me as a chief to say, let's do A, B, C, and D. And as long as I can show the officers on how they can get value, I can show them that this will make them safer, that community safety is linked to their officer safety. I can show them that they get higher job satisfaction because people will have more respect for them. That's the easy thing to manage a department. right? But if it's a constant battle that everything's about stats and crime and chiefs come and go because they don't do crime fast enough, then you're gonna have this cycle that will just keep going.
So I'm gonna turn to Jim to sort of talk a little bit about how we move the needle to get people thinking this way in policing. And then what I'm gonna do, we'll do a quick lightning round with Ralph, Ed, Dahlia, and Liz, just for sort of final comments, if there's anything you wanna get into. And then I really wanna turn it over to questions, because I know that a lot of the folks in this room will have the best questions of the day. And so, Jim,
So this is really about cultural change. I've been through a lot of police training in my life. Ron and I both came up through the California system. It probably has one of the best training systems in the United States. You ever take a class on cost-benefit analysis? Has that phrase ever been mentioned in a police training session that I've taken? Never. Okay, so the very first thing is you got to understand what it is that you're going to now be advocating for, because you put yourself at risk as a police chief. Almost 100% of police chiefs in the United States are at-will employees, even with contracts. They can be bought out very simply. So you think about your career a lot. You can lose your job every 2 weeks. You run for re-election as a police chief in this country. So when you understand it, you have to educate now, and this is part of what Ron said, your bosses. So you're going outside the organization, talking to the mayor, the city council, the manager, what is CBA and what's in it for them? And then you do it internally, and you have to look at changing the reward system. Somebody was talking about the reward systems being framed around number of arrests you make and citations you write and all that. I'm sure there are lots of places in the United States that still do that. The progressive chiefs I know no longer use those metrics. That's not the measuring tool or stick you use anymore. It's about problems you solve or other kinds of metrics. So when you are talking about CBA, it really needs to be a part of a philosophical orientation. It's not a program. It's not a little piece of paper. It is how we see the world. It's a new lens you're going to insert in front of things. We're going to first determine what our purpose is as an organization. We're going to then determine, make sure we're clear about that. If the things we are doing are in fact in alignment with that, and you use that cost-benefit framework. I am less interested, to be honest with you at this point, because I don't have to deal with budgets, with the financial costs of these things as I am the social and the reputational and the relationship costs that these things occur. Like we were talking about body cameras. To me, that's just like buying radios. It's just something you're going to have to do now in police departments. It's all the other stuff around that that's more important. So when you are talking to detectives and community policing cops and all these people that do things, you have to get them framed around this idea that we're going to think about benefits. How do we assess that benefit? How do we evaluate that what we're doing, did it have the benefit we thought? And you change the reward systems to reflect those kinds of things. And you mandate that before we go do this, we're going to talk about this. We're going to, those questions that were up here, right? That should be a template. The mechanics of this are really not very difficult. We've got to inject it into the training and the socialization system of policing, or we're never going to get it done. And then there need to be some products that, like templates and things. Cops have a bias for action. Chiefs are less interested after a certain point about theory as about, okay, now I got it, I got the idea, now how do I make that happen? And they want to get right to it. Cops have a tremendous bias for action. That's how the police, I think, on some level, ended up being the first responders to mental illness and domestic problems and all that, because when society looks around for where's SEAL Team 6, right, in the city structure, guess who it is? It's the cops, and they want somebody to take care of that problem now. And the problem with that is that they never take the problem back, and so the cops continue to own response to mental illness and all that other stuff, which is inappropriate.
thank you so much, Jim. Ralph, quick last thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say community engagement is everything. Community is a large untapped resource. So to the extent that you can align, activate, and ally with communities, you can make a lot of progress as an agency.
Great. Ed?
Oh, that was quicker than I thought it was going to be. I actually just want to echo what Liz said earlier. I think the cost-benefit analysis, when you're looking at just policing, instead of looking at a broader citywide safety, community wellness structure, I think it places it in a much more a narrative that is easier for a larger public to understand, and having that kind of, and echoing what Jim said, not only within policing, but broader, having that narrative, having a consistent narrative, having something that you don't have to be crisis, reacting to crisis all the time, back and forth, I think is from a political standpoint, a much more, and this is a horrible term, but I'm going to use it anyways, a much more sellable type of way to, and get public buy-in, that's the better term, way to get support for it.
Great, thank you. Dahlia?
Also, just teeing off something that was said, I think that, and Liz, I think, flicked at this when she talked about, this transcends just policing and starts to inflect on, how prosecutors do their jobs and judges do their jobs. But I think being super careful to say that, this policing problem then reaches out into sort of using numbers to try to parse whether prosecutors are doing their jobs, whether judges are letting, too many criminals go free. I mean, I just think that there is a really different conversation around justice and what we're talking about in terms of just sort of these raw numerical framings and the ways that it leaches into a larger conversation about what the larger justice system should be doing, I think is something that's pernicious and we need to be careful about.
Thank you. Liz?
And beyond the justice system, I would say, once again, it's not just about crime, it's about safety, which has to do with many, many more sort of civilian values. But I would say that if culture eats policy for lunch every day, that politics eats analysis for lunch every day. And we guess a ton and nowhere more than in the criminal justice system. And it's well beyond the police. The police are sort of part of a bigger ecosystem, not just of the criminal justice system, but of sort of the lives that each of us live every day and meet those problems every day. And so I would just say that we have a much bigger issue that we have to kind of steel ourselves to, which is to really understand what these intersecting problems are in order so we can figure out what a more heterogeneous approach to solving them is.
Great. Before I turn it over, I'll tell you just what I've heard from the panel, and then I'll really open it up to questions and for any of you to challenge any of us, which is what I've heard today is one of the things we have to focus on is what is the question we're trying to answer? Are we trying to talk about crime or safety or accountability? Which raises, I think, really important questions in the cost-benefit space. We've talked a lot about culture, particularly police culture, police culture, and how important that is. And I think we could do a whole panel on that alone, to be honest, and just how hard it is to sort of move the needle. This isn't just about police, it's about an ecosystem. And, I really sort of ask this question in my mind, can we be effective if we just do policing? And I think, to me, the answer is no, but I think we've started to touch on that today. The media, both the power of the media and the challenges, and I really like Dahlia's talking about the umbrage pieces, and I think that resonates a lot with me and how we think about sort of the public conversation we're having. Politics, I don't want to say politics versus data, but there's sort of how politics trumps a lot of the things that I think the values and the things we're talking about today. A lot about communities and the power of communities and the importance, criminal justice and justice, and then of course we talked about beer and hammers and Zumba. But I now turn it, and Zumba, yes. But I now turn it to you to ask questions of these folks. God, it's always like Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I don't understand. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Hi, Chase Madar. I'm a journalist. I have a question for Liz Glazer about cost-benefit analysis from the point of view of a city manager or a city official of law enforcement solutions as a whole. Even among record low crime stats in New York, the liberal mayor has called for and gotten 1,000 new police officers hired. The liberal speaker of the city council, Corey Johnson, has called for even more police officers to be hired. What kind of cost-benefit analysis is going on in City Hall for this? And I ask because at every panel like this I attend, I hear a lot of justified hand-wringing and bemoaning The fact that police officers and police departments are increasingly used for everything, mental illness, homelessness, drug problems. And yet, even in New York, progressive politicians seem utterly addicted to throwing police at everything.
Okay, that's a great question. Liz, is policing, hiring more officers the answer?
I have so many things to say. I mean, I think it is interesting and maybe instructive, and I don't think it's just New York, that across the spectrum, no matter what the political stripe, politicians feel very comfortable with ensuring that their police departments are well supported. I think from the point of view of sort of city management, everything is always a choice. Budgets are choices. And those choices become very acute at moments of fiscal pain. And we have not had a lot of fiscal pain over the last few years, and so there's been a lot of investment in many, many things. Enormous investment in the homeless, an enormous investment in schools, in mental health, in police. And I think really the challenge will come over the next few years if good times do not continue to roll. And so, and that's when analysis is going to be more and more important. But I don't think New York is alone in, not every policy is evaluated in a cost-benefit way. But I think the last thing I would just say to your point, I think there's a lot of scrutiny, as I said in my remarks earlier, in the city of really, should the police be used for everything? For a whole array of reasons. And surely cost is one of them, but how it is we engage with New Yorkers, how it is that we make safety organic and durable is surely a very, very big and important part of it. And there's a lot of work going on exactly that right now.
And can I respond?
Please.
Yeah, I'm gonna go from, I spent a year as the city manager, and I think we talked about this transitioning and not over-relying on police. But until the light switch is there, the city relies on police. And it has, from a city management point of view, it has a safety component, has an economic development component, it has a service-related. So, to have a fully staffed police department where you're still relying on the police to, in other words, we haven't opened up new mental institutions, we have an increased amount of services, so the only response at 2 o'clock in the morning with somebody on their meds is the police officer that I send. Yeah. And now I gotta charge you extra money because I need to make sure that that person is trained for crisis intervention so we can try to minimize uses of force. So there's this, the tough part's going to be, the first stage is the recognition that we're over-relying on police and we need to stop. The second part then is going to be the investment, and when you're going to basically increase the services so you can start decreasing the role that police play. But I don't think you can just arbitrarily say right now, I think we should do this, therefore stop, because you still have to respond to the public safety needs. And unfortunately, it's painful and every community is struggling. There was a reduction in 2008 when you had the recession, and it should have taught us that we still didn't see this increase in crime that everybody thought we would see. There's a few experiments in Texas and others on reinvestments of shutting down prisons and starting to reinvest that money. I would say California, but that was more of a realignment than a reinvestment. But we know it works, and the more we start doing it, I think you can start, I won't say reducing departments, but you can start evaluating them to see, do I need more civilians? Do I need more community members? Do I need more mental health services? And the greatest person that can advocate for that would be a police chief that will stand at the podium in a council meeting saying, I don't need another officer, what I need is some mental health workers out there so my officers will stop going there. I need to make sure that we have people reading at the 3rd grade level appropriately. We need to, in other words, we can start advocating for those safety measures because you have, that's the responsibility. But right now it's kind of tough to do that because people are still turning to the police and they're over-relying on it. So I think it's a struggle for cities that keep wanting to add to police because they don't want to go back where crime was starting to go very high. And I think right now, that's the only solution they have.
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be a whole separate panel on how do you make the case for those types of changes, because I think, you know, we're all advocating for them, we just haven't been able to do it yet. Yes, this may be our last question, we'll see how much time we have, and if we can fit in 2, we'll try.
My name is Arif Ali Khan. I'm the Director of Constitutional Policing and Policy at LAPD. I was actually Deputy Mayor for the City of LA as well for public safety. I think the most important thing you've touched on is this issue of political, and it probably is the biggest deciding factor, the political cost and benefit analysis that the appropriators are making, because it trumps everything. And I think that's why this issue...
Give us the 1 or 2 sentence from your experience
So
on
my
that.
question is, on that, why is there so much of focus on what the police department's supposed to do, and what are the structural things that you think need to happen to minimize that political calculation that will always trump a real CVA analysis?
Anybody in particular wants to take that?
Well, I think this goes back to what we think about public safety, right? And that's just going to be a long-term thing. So we equate public safety with policing. America equates public safety with policing. And until that narrative shifts, until we say after-school programs from 3 to 6, where kids are at most risk, unless that becomes a public safety issue, then the dollars aren't going to be invested in that. And so we're looking, and it doesn't have to be 3 to 6. People are working longer hours, 3 to 7, 3 to 8, whatever it is, or longer school days or whatever. Those are public safety issues, and we don't consider that. And so all of the ways that appropriators look at money, both in Congress and both in city managers and legislatures, there's different buckets of what public safety is versus what all of these other things are. And the more that there's that intersectionality of believing that public safety comes across and there's more people responsible for public safety than just the police, and I think that would be good news for police as well, that it is, as Liz, again, I just think I'm going back to what you're saying, it's just the more it is a holistic investment in it. But until that happens, politicians, will rely back on it's easier to hire more, it's easier just to put everything on policing. And so that's a long-term, unfortunately, it seems like it's a long-term narrative shift that needs to happen.
Can I add one quick piece?
Please.
No?
Yeah.
So I retain an old-fashioned attachment to facts. And I continue to hope that if you get facts into the drinking water, that will help you withstand political crises. I've been proved wrong over and over again, but I continue to adhere to this view. And it is true that there is something both partly true, but also kind of intuitively attractive to people when you say, we're going to reduce crime. The way we're going to reduce crime is we're going to arrest people, we're going to put them in jail. And there's something to that, but it's like, not everything. Doesn't feel as satisfying to say, we're going to reduce crime. The way we're going to do that is we're going to get every 16 to 24-year-old a good job. It's like, oh, please. So, but I think that we have to continue to chip away at that. And I would say, I think we see some hope, and I would just give this example, which is, it used to be alternatives to incarceration and detention. People rolled their eyes and said, oh, please. And I think that, at least in New York City, there's a lot of voting with their feet. Judges, prosecutors, who are able to vote with their feet because voters actually think maybe that's worthwhile. And therefore, even when something terrible happens in an alternative to detention or incarceration program, somebody kills somebody, in the worst instance, the program will sustain itself because there's some natural law cost-benefit analysis that people are doing, saying, yeah, I guess we could be safe if we locked up every single person in the city of New York, but maybe that's not worth it. So go facts.
And can I just make one final comment?
Yep.
I think the community has a lot to play with this. So a couple of things that can help start changing this dynamic. One is, and the police got to play this role, quit taking credit when crime goes down and quit blaming others when it goes up, right? Two is the community, I think, can speak out when it understands crime and makes it very clear that you're going to evaluate the police department for something else. So we've created this environment where we told communities, especially communities of color, that they have to choose between civil rights and safety. And we need to stop giving them that false narrative and show that the protection of those civil rights and the engagement is a better way to get to there, and quit kind of really forcing people to have to accept things. So the very community that will protest against police brutality will then vote for a candidate who wants to add 1,000 cops to the department, because we've been convinced that that's the only way to make us safe. So we got to start the community, and once the community members understand that safety is bigger than the police, and it's about schools and education, everything else that we talked about, jobs and the thing that Ed's are talking about, then that will have an impact on the elected officials, because they basically will read the polls that say 1,000 more cops won't get you there, and that money for 1,000 new cops may be better spent elsewhere, unless you really need 1,000 more cops. But we really got to start with, I think, we got to stop taking these bows every time crime goes down and saying it was because of the great strategy we did, and we did this kind of a policing, versus that we as a community changed a lot of things and look at all the indicators to why crime is down.
That's a perfect way to end and to wrap up, and I'm so grateful for everyone on the panel today. Thank you.
We had guilt, I'll be honest at this point, about the number of panelists and the amount of time each would get to speak, but we did a CBA, and we decided that the only way to get a lot of voices in a conversation is to have a lot of voices in the conversation. I think that all the panels were really terrific, and so thank you again first to all the panelists all day long. If you're with us this afternoon, I just want to tell you, if you have luggage, that it will magically move to the building that you're going to be in. So. Do you like that magic? So out the door to the right and then to the left, and thank you everybody very much. It was a great morning.